In Tolkien's youth, I think the only stable thing through the trials of his early years was King Edward's School, Birmingham.
During his school days, as many students do, Tolkien developed very, very close friendships, with three friends in particular: Christopher Wiseman, G.B. Smith and Rob Gilson.
And the four of them met up at Wiseman's in December 1914 for an event they called the Council of London. And Tolkien experienced a revelation of sorts. He realised that he wanted to become a poet. He realised that he wanted to be a creative writer. This really was the impetus behind the creation of Middle-earth. And the Council of London coincided with Tolkien inventing his first Elvish language.
He'd, up to this point, been studying Latin, Greek, Old English, all these Indo-European languages.
However, I think something which struck him like a bolt from the blue was picking up Charles Eliot's Finnish grammar while he was an undergraduate, because this is a language which really is not at all like anything he'd come across before.
Arvelee ajattelevi, pitkin päätänsä pitävi, kenpä maita kylvämään, toukoja tiittämään.
And it inspired him to devise Quenya, the first Elvish language.
But Tolkien was also very intrigued by Welsh, a language which he liked very much, and he produced another Elvish language, which is Sindarin, which in some ways is rather like Welsh in its phonetic structure.
Mae'r byd wedi newid. Teimla fe yn y dŵr. Teimla fe yn y ddaear. Fedrai ei aroglu yn yr awyr. Ia mae'r prestar ein. Amathon nenen. Amathon y chai. A hanoston ned.
So by 1920, he's already got two fairly well-developed languages, and he wrote this sort of fantasy history to explain, who's speaking these languages, why they're different from each other, how they've developed to the forms that he's given them.
And that is the beginning, the seed of the story which was to become the Silmarillion in the end. And this contains a history of the elves.
It was basically a fall from grace, a story of fall from grace. That is, the elves were put in the world to help fulfill its destiny.
But failed, ultimately, because they were too hungry for knowledge.
So in the background of Tolkien's thinking was the Christian and Jewish story of Adam and Eve and their rebellion against God. This is reflected in the tales of Middle-earth, both in the elves and in the human races, particularly the stories of the destruction of Numenor, the island that was rather like Atlantis. It was destroyed as a consequence of human disobedience.
Numenor was a remarkable place. Numenor was a gift from the gods to the men of Middle-earth who had fought willingly alongside the elves against the forces of evil, but Numenor became corrupted.
Their kings became arrogant. Their kings tried to take eternal life from the Valar. The Valar didn't like that.
And in the end, the Númenóreans, they set up an armada to invade the Undying Lands and take immortality by force.
And Numenor is ultimately drowned by the wrath of God.
Only the faithful, those who had remained true, were rescued and saved.
Isildur, who is mentioned several times, and his father Elendil were among those survivors. And they came and they set up the kingdoms of Gondor in the south and Arnor in the north.
And it was from those people that Aragorn was descended, people who had already demonstrated that they had within them the power to be corrupted, to be flawed.
Aragorn has a lot of moments, there's a nagging doubt he has about his worthiness. He labors from the beginning with the fear he has that he's not going to be up to the task.
Why do you fear the past? You are Isildur's heir, not Isildur himself. You are not bound to his fate.
The same blood flows in my veins.
Aragorn had all the qualities of this ancient civilization, and he was very aware of the problems of power and of misusing power and of being disobedient.
So here is Aragorn representing a race of people whose origin is gone, has been wiped from the face of the earth, is no more. Like Atlantis, it was sucked down into the depths of the ocean. Now, the concept of being overwhelmed by the sea is placed in the book because of something that was very personal to Tolkien.
From childhood, Tolkien recalled having a terrible nightmare, a recurrent dream of a great wave coming in over green fields, engulfing the land.
Now, in The Lord of the Rings, he actually gives this to Faramir, and Faramir is said to have this recurrent dream. In the movie, this is actually shifted and given to Éowyn.
I dreamed I saw a great wave, climbing over green lands and above the hills. I stood upon the brink. It was utterly dark in the abyss before my feet.
And the reason we gave it to Éowyn is simply because we wanted to use it. We couldn't find how to use it with Faramir. It's one of the examples of something that would have just stayed in the book and would never have seen the light of day, and was an incredibly important piece of personal information, I believe, from Professor Tolkien.
All writers pour into their work elements of themselves. So, for example, when you look at the way in which he creates the people of Rohan, you feel instinctively this is a man who understood horses.
Before the war, Tolkien had joined something called King Edward's Horse. It was a battalion, and this was his first and his major experience of being around horses, and he seems to have shone.
Because the job that he got was breaking in the horses. And he was actually rather aggrieved about it, because no sooner had he broken in a horse and got it to do what it was supposed to do, than that horse was taken away and given to some other officer, and he was given another rookie horse to break in.
This experience obviously shows that there's more than mere abstractions behind the whole idea of Rohan.
I can imagine the Rohirrim as representing a form of wish fulfillment for Tolkien, because as he describes them, they're very similar to Anglo-Saxons, but with this addition of horses.
And Tolkien actually had a wild theory, and the theory was that if the English had had a cavalry, we would probably never have lost the Battle of Hastings, because when these great horse masters came across the sea from France, they just trampled all over us.
And I think he felt that with the Norman invasion, which was a great catastrophe, that influx of Norman culture prevented a full flowering of English mythology.
So the riders are an image of the Anglo-Saxons not as they were, but as they might have been. And perhaps if they'd retained a little bit more of, as it were, rider culture, then they might not have lost at Hastings, and present English civilization would not have been as Frenchified as it has been, something which Tolkien thought was a literary disaster.
So the creation of the people of Rohan not only shows that Tolkien had an innate understanding of horses, but that he had the greatest respect and reverence for them. And this is something which comes from his experiences in the First World War. We have to remember that the First World War was the last of the great battles where people rode out with horses. It was the age when horsepower met machine power.
For Tolkien, the fact that machinery had entered warfare takes away any of that old romantic heroism. The nobility of warfare no longer exists once you're able to deal death at a distance.
Tolkien obviously experienced mechanized warfare at its worst in the First World War, and it left a profound impression on him.
The story he wrote straight after the Battle of the Somme was called The Fall of Gondolin, and it tells how a great and beautiful city of the elves is attacked by Morgoth.
And the force, of course, consists of orcs, yes, but also dragons and also what look like tanks.
Which, of course, Tolkien had seen on the Somme. Tanks were a secret weapon that made its debut there in September 1916.
And this sense of mechanization as being a force of war is something which carries through to the Lord of the Rings. You see it in the preparations that Saruman makes for war. You see it in the mechanical way in which the forces of Mordor march on the Alliance.
As he was writing The Lord of the Rings, you can sometimes see Tolkien, as it were, recycling earlier works. I know he didn't do that with The Fall of Gondolin. He didn't sort of cut and paste chunks out and make it into the Siege of Minas Tirith. But there's obviously a similarity. We have Gondolin and Gondor. They come from the same root in Elvish. And there's a sense also of the warfare of machine against wall. And you could say there's yet another connection, which is in both of them, Gondor and Gondolin, are attempts to make things static. The elves have this urge to hang on to things and lock them into stasis. And you could say that the same thing in a way is true of Denethor. Gandalf asks him, "What do you want?" And he says, "I would have things the way they were, as in the times of my long fathers." And just like, as it were, the prehistoric elves, he won't accept any compromises. He'd rather die. In fact, he does rather die.
There is no victory.
I think one of the things that Tolkien realized quite early on, as he wrote The Lord of the Rings, was that it was going to be impossible to put into the book everything that was crowding into his mind. All the links and connections back to other stories and all the things that he knew underpinned this great structure he was creating, he wanted to tell people.
He built things in at the start because he didn't know how it was going to finish. And then when it got to the end, he hadn't got space for them, or he couldn't bring them in without spoiling the balance.
So he started developing this elaborate idea of creating appendices to the book.
The whole tale of Aragorn and Arwen is moved into an appendix. It clearly ought to be part of the story, but how are you going to tell it?
He did think about how he could work her into the body of the text and never found a satisfactory way of doing it.
It would have slowed the story down completely and been out of place.
But actually, Arwen is a very important figure because she introduces the theme of death.
The fact that Arwen casts off her immortality for the love of a mortal man is truly the greatest sacrifice in the entire story.
And perhaps one of the strange things there is that you can see Tolkien sympathizing very strongly with Arwen. He sees the story from her angle, perhaps even more than from Aragorn's. She wittingly chooses death, but she does that, really, out of love.
I choose a mortal life.
We do not realize just how significant and important this character is, but her relationship with Aragorn is absolutely central to how Aragorn behaves.
The condition that Elrond puts on Aragorn is that he may not have his daughter Arwen's hand in marriage until he defeats Sauron, essentially, and becomes king. And once he's earned that, then he's earned the right.
Stories about a mortal and an immortal pairing, are there in the folklore of Northern Europe. But they're, I think, especially important to Tolkien. One of them is Aragorn and Arwen, but there are others back in his mythology. There's the union of Beren and Luthien. Luthien is a very high-ranking elf princess. Beren is a survivor from a human group which has been almost wiped out.
And Beren stumbles upon her while she's dancing in a woodland glade, and he's never seen anything so beautiful in his life, and his heart is struck still by the sight of her.
And her father, of course, has no intention of giving up his daughter to a ragged stranger from the wilderness, and a human at that.
This story not only was very important in the early tales of Middle-earth, but it had particular meaning for Tolkien in his life. As a young man, he'd fallen in love with Edith Bratt.
They fell in love, but Tolkien's guardian said that he couldn't marry till he was 21.
And Tolkien, being the stubborn, pig-headed sort he was, waited till 1 minute after midnight on his 21st birthday and then wrote her a proposal of marriage and posted it. And she accepted it.
Their love is something we know very little about, but we do know that he and his young wife took a walk in a wood that was filled with hemlock, and that she danced for him and sang for him. And that image, that very, very personal image of the woman he loved, became the image that he used to describe the meeting of Beren and Luthien.
Tolkien identified so closely with this story that when Edith died, he had the name Luthien written on her tombstone.
I think that's a great statement about his love for his wife. He felt that she, in a way, had given him something immensely precious, which he valued above everything else.
Some people say that he tended to stick women on pedestals, but I think if you read deeper into it, especially if you go into the story of Luthien and Beren, you understand that it's about intimacy.
And for Tolkien, it clearly was the central myth of love at the heart of his work, his love for his wife.
I think her death, shattered him completely.
Love and loss are inextricably bound. For Tolkien to have lost Edith really was the end of his world in many ways.
And when he eventually himself died, the name Beren is on his stone. Beren and Luthien, Arwen and Aragorn, Ronald and Edith. In a way, they are all one and the same.
One very important aspect of the story of Beren and Luthien was the way that the lives of human beings and elves became intermingled. And the great significance of these stories for Tolkien was tied in with his Christian belief in the ultimate incarnation, that God humbled himself and became a human being. In Tolkien's work, the elves represent perfection and the ideal qualities of human life. And so, through the intermarriage of elves and human beings, their lives intermingle, resulting in a fuller humanity.
And in their coming together, a part of the elves remains with us today and passes in to the bloodline of men, so that all is not lost.
We do have a glimpse of Eldarion, the son by Aragorn and Arwen. In this bloodline, this perfect mixture of elvenkind and mankind. This one scion of both trees remains and will be a strong leader for the people of Middle-earth, who represents everything that is good in Middle-earth and not just mankind.
And from that point on, the divine and the human are intermingled. And so we have a much more intimate relationship with our Creator through that.
And if you look closely and listen closely, the music of Mozart, the painting of Raphael, you can see it. The elves are still with us.
Tolkien structures the books in a very strange way, where he has these big chunks. There's not the intercutting, the tight cross-cutting that there is in the movies. It's just big blocks.
The way in which Tolkien writes means that he leapfrogs in his narrative. He tells you about one group of people, then he goes off and tells you about another.
But one of the effects of the kind of strand-by-strand narration of The Lord of the Rings is that the characters on any one strand don't know what's going on the other strands. And one of the most important cross-connecting devices is the Palantir.
7 Palantiri, the seeing stones, were brought from Numenor by Elendil to Middle-earth, and he installed them all around his realm as a way of communicating.
And the Palantir always tells you the truth, but it encourages you to draw the wrong conclusion from it. And I think they're used 4 times in The Lord of the Rings as a book. The first time is Saruman has been using it, and it seems that Sauron has been showing him his build-up of power.
So Saruman is quickly corrupted in his way, because what he sees is the opportunity to fulfill his own ambitions.
Next time is Pippin looking in it, and Sauron draws from this the wrong conclusion. He sees a hobbit in the Orthanc stone. He assumes that Saruman has the hobbit, and furthermore that the hobbit has the ring, so Saruman has the ring.
Which is the reason that Pippin must be removed to a place of safety, which is Minas Tirith.
Next time Sauron looks in it, he actually sees Aragorn.
Aragorn takes the seeing stone and he looks into it in order to draw the eye of Sauron. It's a tremendously brave act.
And Sauron, once again, draws the wrong conclusion, which is that Aragorn has the ring. Now, this is very important because one thing it does is to make Sauron strike too fast. And as it says in the book, the hasty stroke oft goes astray.
The other interesting use of the Palantir is that the seeing stone that is still held at Minas Tirith has been used by Denethor, the Lord Steward.
In the White Tower, Denethor also has a Palantir.
Do you think the eyes of the White Tower are blind? I have seen more than you know.
And if you check the dates, which I have, he's actually seen Frodo in the hands of Sauron, because Sauron has already captured Frodo. So Denethor looks in the Palantir, and like everybody else, he draws the wrong conclusion. So Sauron thinks Aragorn's got the ring. Denethor thinks Sauron's got the ring. And in fact, at that moment, Sam's got the ring, which nobody knows at all except Sam.
It's a very modern concept in a way. It's the concept of misinformation. And it so reflects how modern communication can give people a fraction of something and by so doing influence the way in which they react, the way in which they behave.
So the Palantir actually, just like the Mirror of Galadriel, is very dangerous as a guide to action. All these are bad ways to make decisions. You should actually make decisions based on what you yourself know. Well, the corollary of that, though, I think, is that you mustn't try and second guess.
You may not have enough knowledge to be able to have just that one bit of information that would totally transform your supposition about the way things are.
And I think, actually, that Tolkien had this in his head as a kind of infantryman slogan, because the infantryman slogan is, look to your front. If you start looking behind you and worrying about what your mates are doing, and they're looking at you and wondering what you're doing, then nobody is paying attention to what they should be doing. So you have to slog on. The trouble with that, of course, is that you can very easily persuade yourself that things are going badly somewhere else, so there's no chance for you, so that you might as well give up. And once you've given up, of course, this prophecy is self-fulfilling.
Despair plays a huge part in the symbolism of Lord of the Rings, because it is the flip side of hope. And it's played out most obviously through the characters of Theoden and Denethor.
They're both old men who've lost their sons. Theoden has lost Theodred, and Denethor has lost Boromir.
They also both have surviving male heirs, but they don't regard them. Theoden doesn't regard Eomer, his nephew, as having any worth. Denethor doesn't regard Faramir, his son, as having any value.
You could draw this out. The parallels are really quite close. But actually, the thing is that they then take different routes.
Denethor has succumbed to despair. He has allowed his mind to become prey to the blackness that creeps out from the Dark Tower because he has looked into the Palantir.
He persuades himself. He knows what's going to happen.
Gondor is lost. There is no hope for men.
And so he falls into despair and he ends up committing suicide, which is, you might say, the ultimate form of despair. Now, Theoden is heading the same way.
Theoden eventually manages to use the loss of his son as fuel to impel him into action.
And instead of succumbing to despair and just looking at the task that lies before him, this overwhelming army that they face at the Pelennor Fields, he rides to glory.
When it comes to it, there are more powerful things for him than despair, and one of them is the urge to live up to his ancestors. That's what he says as he's dying.
I go to my fathers, in whose mighty company I shall not now feel ashamed.
To understand The Lord of the Rings, you have to understand something that was motivating Tolkien very strongly, which is that however dark and bad and terrible things seem, that there is a moment of turning, a moment when dark is turned to light, when dawn dispels night. He called it the eucatastrophe.
Well, we have a very familiar term, catastrophe, which is a sudden turn from good to bad. And Tolkien said that actually there ought to be the opposite of this, which is eucatastrophe. And eucatastrophe is the sudden and unpredicted and unpredictable turn from bad to good.
Tolkien related eucatastrophe to the story of Christ, to the idea that out of the tragedy of the crucifixion could come salvation for all mankind.
And Tolkien finds it not only in the resurrection, but also powerfully in fairy tales.
Happily ever after is the ending of almost every fairy tale ever conceived. And he also said it's something that you experience in real life, but how rarely you experience it in the modern novel. And in The Lord of the Rings, that is what you experience. At the crack of doom, when all seems to be at the point of potential failure, disaster has been reached, the corner is turned, the happy event ensues. This is where that eucatastrophe, that happy turn of events, is played out. That is where good comes out of evil.
At the heart of this story, amidst all these heroic deeds and noble warriors, friendship is one of the most powerful themes of the whole tale, and it must in some part hark back to Tolkien's lost friendships.
Tolkien's group of friends at school kind of formalised the bond between them in his final year as a school pupil at King Edward's School in Birmingham.
And so they called themselves very grandly the Tea Club and Barovian Society.
The TCBS wanted to reinvigorate the Middle Ages, to bring them back to a world which they felt, was missing something.
It's what every young person feels, that they stand at a point in life when they can change the world. But this same group of people were very soon to be sucked into the First World War.
Tolkien served in the Great War alongside several of his closest friends.
And he hoped that he would be able to join his friend G.B. Smith's battalion. As things turned out, he managed to join the same regiment, but a different unit. Smith, who of course was the fellow poet in the TCBS, hugely appreciated what Tolkien was doing in writing the first poetry of what became Middle-earth. Tolkien sent him poems that Smith read in the trenches. One night, Smith was about to head out on a patrol, and he wrote to Tolkien.
My chief consolation is that if I am scuppered tonight, there will still be left a member of the great TCBS to voice what I dreamed and what we all agreed upon. May God bless you, my dear John Ronald, and may you say the things I have tried to say, long after I am not there to say them, if such be my lot.
Clearly, Smith's encouragement, sealed by his death on the Somme in December 1916, must have been both an inspiration and something of a burden for Tolkien.
And in the subsequent conflicts, Tolkien lost all but one of those close friends. It was a loss that remained with him for his whole life.
Tolkien seems to have felt that he had inherited from the others their ambitions, and that it was up to him to fulfill them.
All hopes were pinned on Tolkien. It was up to Ronald to bear the torch, to go forward.
But Tolkien had a recurrent fear, and the fear was that nobody was ever going to read his work. And it was actually a very well-justified fear. He was 62 when The Lord of the Rings did get published. And just about the time that the book came out in 1954, Tolkien wrote a letter in which he said that once upon a time, of course it's all, he's given up on it now, he did hope to create a mythology which other people would take over and could adapt and use.
He was going to create a kind of grand tapestry, and he would sketch out the myths, and then other people would come in with music and art and song.
But he says, well, my crest has fallen since, I haven't got such immense ambitions. But of course, actually, he could have had such immense ambitions because that's what's happened.
Lo and behold, he discovers he's got an audience of people who not only want to devour it, but want more, please, give us more.
One of the surprising things about The Lord of the Rings is that although it's an English setting, it has an appeal throughout the world. And I think it must be because Tolkien is touching upon something that's central to who we are as human beings.
There is a hopefulness to the story and to life, and that's what Tolkien's on about too, looking ahead and saying, well, I hand this to you now. I hand this story to you that was handed to me, and let's see what you can do with it.
I think Lewis said once that a myth was a story that everybody knew about, even if they couldn't remember ever reading or hearing any version of it. And I think that's rather like that with Lord of the Rings. Everybody knows about it, even if they haven't read it. It's become part of the mental furniture of the culture.
And I think that is exactly what happens with true works of art, real works of art. It enables those works to survive changes of opinion, changes of culture, of history, because each new generation of readers finds new meanings in it.
Years and years and years before Peter Jackson ever embarked on this project, Tolkien said that he thought that The Lord of the Rings was a book which was highly unsuitable to the process of dramatization.
An unfilmable book. That's what Tolkien thought. He let the film rights go for nothing because he knew it could not be made into a film.
There's enormous amounts of material to cover, and actually it all seems to get more and more compressed. In fact, in The Return of the King, it does get more and more compressed, and material which would have taken half a chapter earlier on now takes a paragraph, and then you're moving on.
I mean, The Two Towers has a huge amount of story. The movie is obviously 3 hours long, and there's no way that we could put all of The Two Towers into The Two Towers.
And the fact is that events which take place in the book called The Two Towers do not chronologically actually happen within that time frame. They actually take place running alongside or at the same time as events which take place in The Return of the King.
When Frodo is being carried away by the orcs after he's been wrapped up in the spiderweb by Shelob, at that exact moment in the book, if you really break the timelines down, you discover that Gandalf and Pippin are at Minas Tirith and the siege of Minas Tirith is underway.
So what Peter has done in the movie version is to iron out the timelines and bring all the action together chronologically.
I was concerned at the end of the second movie because I could see how much they'd got to do. Not only had they got to get in the whole of Volume 3, but there were something like 8 chapters out of Volume 2, which were still coming up.
You have all of the scenes with Frodo and Sam going past the fortress of Minas Morgul. They climb up the cliff, they arrive at Shelob's tunnel. Frodo has an encounter, Sam ultimately fights Shelob. Then the orcs carry Frodo's wrapped up body away. All of that was actually part of the Book of the Two Towers.
The remaining chapters that we took out of The Two Towers and stuck into The Return of the King, the film, were The Road to Isengard, Flotsam and Jetsam, The Voice of Saruman, The Palantir. We made the decision quite early on to strip those down, pass those down to their bare minimum of what we needed from them. So bits and pieces of them appear in different shapes and forms, such as the Palantir, which Pippin acquires, and you see them in the Death of Saruman scene.
I think if you see these movies now, you would understand why we did what we did. It seemed like a natural thing to do. It wasn't those big dilemmas. I mean, it was actually quite simple, and it happened at the beginning, and we never changed it, and I think it was the smartest thing to do.
They did such a great job of trimming, not necessarily the fat, but trimming those moments and those sequences from the book that didn't necessarily have a place in the story that they were trying to tell. And they did that so well without losing the essence of the story and losing the essence of the books.
As long as you're carrying the spirit of the book with you, I think you can do a lot of things differently.
One significant place where we did deviate very, very intentionally was that Frodo sends Sam away, when they're making their way towards Shelob's lair, and that the characters actually separate, which of course doesn't happen in the books.
We felt that we had a character who was actively trying to separate and disrupt the goal of our other two characters, that being Gollum, and he was never going to get a payoff. He never really succeeds. So we knew we wanted a scene where he successfully separated the two of them. I think more importantly than that, we knew we wanted Frodo to enter Shelob's tunnel alone.
Master must go inside the tunnel.
It's all about the tension, the current tension in the film, and it is more tense, the fact that Frodo goes in there alone. I think it's good that Frodo's not always right. He's not this angelic character, that he does not have complete faith in Sam.
The original version of that scene had Frodo pretty aggressive, borderline psychotic, sort of really saying, get out of here, you can't help me, in a really pretty venomous kind of tone.
I'm sorry, Sam. Go home!
What we were playing was really that Frodo was a junkie by this stage, that he was addicted to the ring.
And it was changed later as we had more time to think about it. We realized that was it was a little bit too intense for Frodo. They had me start doing additional dialogue recording, just kind of tone it down to sort of keep the intensity but not make it so, so evil. So I asked them if they had any other takes. I was like, did we ever do any versions that weren't nearly as intense? And I had. There were a couple in there that were a little bit calmer, certainly for the go home moment, instead of the
Go home!
It was more quiet and subdued.
Go home.
So ADR really became a great asset to us as we were able to kind of re-envision things and rethink things. You know, not only perfect upon performance, but really hone in on how we want a scene to carry itself out and ultimately what we want the themes of these scenes to be.
Hey, pages hot off the press. Oh, wow.
As a fan of the books, you fall in love with certain passages, and then sometimes you hoard them, and then you try to make them work. And Fran came to me with this scene that she'd written with the lines from the book which describe what Frodo sees when he passes over towards the Undying Lands.
And the ship went out into the high sea and passed on into the west, until at last, on a night of rain, Frodo smelled a sweet fragrance on the air, and heard the sound of singing that came over the water. And then it seemed to him that, as in his dream in the house of Bombadil, the grey rain curtain turned all to silver glass and was rolled back, and he beheld white shores and beyond them a far green country under a swift sunrise.
That is the image that Tolkien has of the land the other side of death. That's what you're going to.
What the filmmakers did was to take the essence of that description and to give it to Gandalf in describing just such a scene to Pippin.
What? Gandalf? See what?
White shores. And beyond, the far green country under a swift sunrise.
Splendid words to say, and I suppose touching that Gandalf should choose to say them as words of comfort to a young man.
And Ian McKellen read it and knew exactly what to do with it immediately, and so did Billy.
You know, he'd have me in tears just telling me about this far green country, you know.
That isn't so bad.
No. No, it isn't.
The Mouth of Sauron as a sequence was not quite as powerful as it is in the book.
Because in the book it turns on the tension of whether Frodo is alive or not. And we as a reader don't know that, because the last time we heard from Frodo, we knew he had been captured by these really terrifying orcs.
Because the movie deviates from the book in this respect in terms of the chronology of how events are laid out, at this point, despite, you know, the Mouth of Sauron telling you, implying basically that Frodo is dead or worse, we all know he's not.
And in a way, it makes the scene a bit redundant, because we're having Gandalf and the others reacting to the horror of the thought of Frodo's death. Frodo. And yet we, the audience, are sitting back thinking, well, he's not dead, he's alive. And so it takes a lot of the heat out of it. It's a good example of how our restructuring of the storytelling and the parallel storylines is was a disadvantage to us in this particular case.
And in the end, if a scene's giving you that much grief in the storytelling, you should probably get rid of it before you shoot it and find another way to do the storytelling. But I think everybody loved the concept of the Mouth of Sauron and that challenge and that showdown.
For me, I always loved that there was some physical representation of that evil, of Sauron, because the only version of Sauron that we've seen is in the prologue of Fellowship of the Ring.
Sauron's always proven difficult in these films, especially to me. I mean, I've always had problems with my sort of movie making hat on. I mean, it works fine in the book, no problem with the book, but your villain is basically a giant eyeball.
You've got in Sauron a disembodied representation of evil, a force, a presence, yes, but no physical manifestation.
We felt that we really had to do something more than just have Sauron staying in his tower as this flaming eye, that we had to have him make an appearance outside the Black Gates at the end of Return of the King. And we also felt that Aragorn has come this distance with his journey and that Sauron is his enemy, and that we had to somehow have this personal duel between Aragorn and Sauron. And that's not in the book, but we felt that it had to be in the movie.
The original thought was to have some sort of, angelic presence, which essentially was the devil in disguise. The moment where Aragorn is dismounted and they're all standing there vastly outnumbered, and this blinding bright light shines on us, which blinds, everyone except Aragorn at a certain moment sees something and walks toward it.
It was Anatar, which is the representation of Sauron as he is in his true angelic form, not in the destroyed sort of evil force that inhabits the rest of the film.
It was the form he took when he managed to fool the elves into actually creating the ring. And we thought that, okay, we've got Sauron confronted by this heir of Isildur. In a way, he's got to be feeling a bit nervous. He hasn't been able to find the ring, and he comes forward in this guise of seduction and beauty.
Then the angelic figure suddenly turns into Sauron and attacks Aragorn.
We played around with the idea that Sauron comes out and he's even bigger than he ever was before. But Pete kind of knew that those 14-foot monsters very, very, very rarely work.
We were trying to make Sauron look like he was way bigger than he really was. I mean, it was an actor in armour who was not much taller than Viggo.
And what we originally shot was, 3 days of fighting this whole, knockdown drag-out with Sauron.
It was not what Tolkien imagined. And we realised that was actually totally demeaning to what Aragorn was doing. The story was so clear as to what was happening that this was all about Frodo and Sam. And Aragorn realises if they're still alive, then he has to do what he can to help Frodo and Sam. And so Aragorn's heroism is not a one-on-one duel with the big villain. His heroism is his attempt to put his own life and the life of his troops on the line in the vague hope and dream that it somehow may give Frodo and Sam that little opportunity to help them complete their mission. But we thought, well, we have to have Viggo doing some sort of a heroic fight, and we thought, what's a worthy foe for Aragorn if it's not going to be Sauron? And we thought, well, a troll, a big, mean, armoured troll, except we had not shot any footage of Viggo fighting a troll. But we had shot the Sauron fight, which we had long since discarded.
In the end, we used what we could, mostly on my side, and then added the troll.
And then when we decided to ditch the whole Sauron fight and to simply, make it more about buying time for Frodo, I thought that, well, all this bright light footage that we have of looking and reacting to the light, that there was no way we could use that. But then it was actually Viggo himself that said to me, well, we could use some of that footage if we had the idea that the eye flares out. It's almost like it's beaming in on Aragorn. It's psychically affecting him.
That worked for Pete, I think, because it intercut with what was going on with Sam and Frodo. Without having to cut over to them, you realize, so they shot, I think, then they shot that scene where you see the light leaving Sam and Frodo.
We sort of got the best of both worlds because we had that moment where he's drawn away, and just when you think that he's somehow being affected by this force, he turns and he says,
"For Frodo."
And you realise that he's not affected by it at all, and it really worked quite well. And so some of that original Sauron the Fair footage actually made it into the film in a completely different context. The destruction of the ring was always one of those really problematical situations, a bit like whether Sauron appears at the end. It was basically the decision really had to be made is do you stick with the book, which has Gollum finally grabbing the ring once he's bitten Frodo's finger off. He stands on that rock and he is so overwhelmed with joy. He sort of dances. I think in the book he does a little sort of almost like it's described as a dance.
But Gollum, dancing like a mad thing, held aloft the ring he stepped too far, toppled, wavered for a moment on the brink, and then with a shriek he fell.
Peter had this notion or the sense that he wanted Frodo not to be inactive, that we kind of invested all this energy and time with this character and then just have him be a bystander in that moment.
And so our first concept that we originally had in our screenplay was that Gollum has the ring, Frodo has his finger bitten off, Frodo jumps to his feet, and he comes and he pushes Gollum. He doesn't touch the ring, he pushes Gollum and the ring over. So Gollum and the ring fall, and Frodo kind of disappears and ends up hanging on the rock.
I know Fran and I had a few doubts about that. We were worried about how that was going to look. And then when Pete actually shot it, and he went for it, the very first time he shot it, it did feel as if Frodo was killing Sméagol and Gollum, as if it was an act of murder.
It's not quite fulfilling Tolkien's theme that it was sparing Gollum's life was what ultimately caused the ring to be destroyed.
That it was fate, in that moment, fate that tipped Gollum over the edge.
So we then decided at the very last minute, and it was really the very last minute because it was Andy Serkis's final day in New Zealand. It was Elijah's second to last day in New Zealand. We were about to lose these guys forever in terms of their involvement on the film, and we thought, you know what, we've got to squeeze in. It wasn't part of our schedule or our plan during pickups, but we thought we want one more go at this.
We wanted it to kind of appear somewhat ambiguous, so that Gollum would fall over more out of the struggle and accident than out of Frodo killing him.
You just go, ring, and then it becomes hands, and then it becomes like, you know, and it's like a push me, pull you, with the ring being the centre. Yeah.
We wanted to make it look much more like Frodo's trying to get the ring back. It's not about killing Gollum, it's not about destroying the ring, it's about him taking the ring back.
Really the mirror image of the beginning, which is two addicts slugging it out for the possession, and again it goes all back to the ring.
And we also knew that we needed Frodo to go over the edge. We needed for him to go. And the reason we wanted him to go over the edge is because we felt one of the most dramatic moments is not just the death of Gollum and then Sam saying, "Come on, Mr. Frodo, we've got to get out of here." It's got to be,
"Don't you let go."
And to make that a tough choice for Frodo, we needed to give him the other choice, which was to let go and end it all. And you can't do that by just having him stay there and not get up. You needed to have him dangling over the edge.
The lesson really in terms of the filmmaking from that is you don't stop making the movie. And we were just always rewriting scenes and writing new scenes and shooting stuff and tweaking the films and stuff.
Good.
And constantly challenging ourselves really to try to think of last minute improvements.
Hey, one more for luck. That was great, Sean. That was a good one. One more for luck. Quickly, we're still rolling.
The Scouring of the Shire is basically, 70 or 80 pages of story that happens after the ring is destroyed.
They arrive home and surprise you not with a happy ending, but with the fact that, whilst they've been off saving the world, this evil has managed to infect their own home.
So they think they've won, and then they go back and they find their whole homeland has been almost destroyed.
And I think Tolkien perhaps makes the point that the Shire isn't invulnerable. It just thinks it is. But it too should actually bear some part of the pain and the casualties of Middle-earth.
And this is where the real nature of evil is genuinely brought home to the reader, because we never thought that the Shire could be spoiled.
We did pay homage to it in the Fellowship of the Ring. When Frodo looks into Galadriel's mirror, he sees exactly the imagery from the Scouring of the Shire. He sees Hobbiton destroyed, he sees the line of hobbits chained.
You see him see the sort of the Shire kind of become like a horrible, almost Holocaust factory kind of environment. So you sort of a tip of the hat to it there. And then in this extended cut DVD of Return of the King, you also have it in that the way Saruman and Wormtongue interact together, the way he ultimately mistreats Wormtongue and then is stabbed and killed with the dagger, is essentially what does happen in the Scouring of the Shire. It's just been transplanted to atop Orthanc Tower.
I think the reason to lose the Scouring of the Shire to me was very straightforward. It was one of those no-brainers. You know, at the very beginning of this process, we'd identified the spine of our movies being Frodo taking the ring to Mordor, which means that the climax of our movies is Frodo destroying the ring. Now, we obviously have a denouement. In fact, the denouement of Return of the King is long and extensive, and it's 20 minutes, and which is 20 minutes that we wanted to spend covering the damage to Frodo as a result of this journey that he's had. To get to that point where the ring's destroyed and then to sort of deviate into a completely different event and storyline, to me, felt anticlimactic, I guess is what I'd describe it.
You can't start up the story again, not after nearly 9 hours of storytelling, which I know people are going to find ironic given the ending that is on this movie.
We actually reduced it down a lot to what it was. It was actually quite a lot longer at one stage. There were huge amounts of people we missed out. I mean, what happened to Gimli and what happened to Legolas. There were scenes shot of those people. We sort of tried to mould it together so it flowed reasonably well. But I can understand a lot of the viewers did sort of find there's too many endings, and there's been a lot of discussion about that.
I was backstage at the Golden Globes, and Jack Nicholson's backstage, and he starts talking to me about Lord of the Rings. And he's like, "Did you die?" And I said, well, yeah. I mean, it sort of depends on how you look at it, with him going away to the Undying Lands at the end. And he's like, "What are you talking about? I left a half an hour before that." So I was like, "Well, wait, you didn't see the end of the film? You didn't even see the end. So you didn't even see, like, you know, Frodo and getting on the boat." He's like, "Oh no, too many endings, man. Should have ended it a lot sooner than that." He thought there were too many endings. So he went out to get the car and get the car warm for his family.
But quite honestly, I've never quite seen it as multiple endings. I think, you know, it is to some degree in the sense that you have to pay off Aragorn and Arwen. But to me, that is the only other ending. And so whilst it's vital for Aragorn to have that climax and to bring him and Arwen together, because God knows we'd spent so much of these movies having Aragorn and Arwen apart, the tension of what's going to happen to them, where you have to resolve that. But we were certainly never intending to end the film at that particular point, because that's not what our story is about. Our story is about Frodo. It was never Aragorn's story. We wanted to end with the fate of Frodo, if you like, experiencing what life is like through his eyes on his return home, to the point that he can no longer stay there.
How do you go on when in your heart you begin to understand there is no going back?
I think the true climax of the movie is the passing of Frodo from this world, whether you perceive that as a metaphor for death or whatever you want to call it. It was for me.
We wanted to do exactly the same ending as in the book, and we wanted the last line of the film to be the last line of the book. I mean, that was very important to us, where Sam says,
"Well, I'm back."
Which is basically saying it's over. It's time to get on with our lives. Whatever is in front of us, this is the beginning of a new life, you know.
The reason Fran and Philippa and Peter are worthy of the Best Adapted Screenplay Oscar that they won is because they were tireless and merciless with themselves.
You never just say this is perfect. You know, you're always fighting and grappling with yourself to try to push it further and further and take every opportunity you can.
It's hard to imagine anybody else being able to pull that many elements from the book, from the appendix, from the Silmarillion, from the Hobbit, and also being open to contributions from different people.
And now we have two roads to Middle-earth, two roads into the map, Tolkien himself and Tolkien as interpreted by Jackson.
You know, and I hope that what we've done is certainly in keeping with the spirit of Tolkien, and one of the dreams, I guess, is that if he was in a position to be able to see these films, that he would be happy with what we have added and what we've changed and what we've simplified. Well, he probably wouldn't be happy with what we've simplified, but I hope he would at least, you know, have some sense of delight in the fact that that this mythology that he set out to create is now taking on a life separate to him. The Lord of the Rings as a film was an idea that we had, and it was just literally never even had a conversation about where you'd shoot it. It was just like, well, you know, we're living in the country where it should be shot.
New Zealand has always been Middle Earth to me because I was a New Zealand boy who'd never travelled anywhere else when I first read the book, you know, and so you always associate it with what you know.
If you live in New Zealand and you read that book, you kind of somehow feel that you're surrounded by Middle Earth. It's not a conscious thing, but you're just aware of the landscape, and you read the book, and the book's all about landscape, and somehow the two, you know, feel they're related in some form.
So we have landscapes, but let's build all of this art and architecture to go in them. And it was such a rare gift to hand over to a couple of conceptual artists, and it was, you know, lots of hard work.
On a typical movie, if you're doing the design work for the film, you're there for pre-production, you maybe overlap a bit into production, but the second you really start to get into the heavy part of production, the original design team aren't necessarily required. Whereas in Lord of the Rings, because we were doing 3 movies at once, and because it was an evolutionary process, the design process was also equally evolutionary and consuming over the entire length of the production.
I first came onto this project along with John Howe over 6 years ago. And I think we were given a rough period of possibly 6 months that we'd need to complete our part of the work. And I've just been, you know, solidly working really for 6 years.
Last week, Alan Lee did a drawing for one of the menus that's on the DVD extended cut. I mean, it's been a constant design process for these folks. And that whole thing with the design team being involved from beginning to the very bitter end was very important, I think, in terms of ensuring that Peter's vision ended up on the screen, as well as the world of Tolkien. You felt like you were there, and these guys were the reason for that.
It was always kind of, how are we going to make this better? How are we going to make it work? How are we going to please Peter, you know, to make it as he expects?
I would always be saying, of course we can do it to Peter, and I'd always be saying to our guys in the background, how the f*** are we going to do this?
So they came slowly to the White Bridge. Here the road, gleaming faintly, passed over the stream in the midst of the valley and went on, winding deviously up towards the city's gate. Figures stood there at its head, carven with cunning in forms human and bestial, but all corrupt and loathsome.
The Minas Morgul Bridge is a corner of a road that runs towards the front gates of Minas Morgul. We ended up building the roadway itself. It started and finished perhaps over a length of 50 metres. And then we had just the beginning part of the bridge that sort of had a bit of a forced perspective thing to it, and then terminated at a blue screen that married in with the miniature of Minas Morgul. Our set included sculptures that were at the front end of the bridge that were designed by John Howe.
The design of those was actually an extravagant doodle. They just ended up appearing like that on the paper, and once I'd finished, I thought, oh, gee, those look significantly like Balrogs. I wouldn't mind having a couple actually set beside in front of my door. And this is, you know, Weta Workshop, if you're listening, make some statues, because I'd love to have a couple, please.
We had a bit of a problem on the Minas Morgul Bridge. We had a small fire that almost destroyed the whole set.
The urethane foams that we use, if it's mixed improperly, can be dangerous.
And a pile of foam spontaneously combusted in the middle of the night.
This is all the fire damage from this morning, and all the plaster and all the first layer of foam's been burnt off, but I'm just going to bang off all the loose stuff, and then we'll plaster it again, and we'll keep it. Looks good. Hopefully they don't like the idea and we have to burn all our sets, eh?
You know, like they say, the show must go on. We pulled out the parts that had been burning. Luckily, it hadn't destroyed the whole set or the building it was in, and rebuilt it, and away we went.
Come away, Hobbits. We climb. We must climb.
The Stairs of Cirith Ungol actually started in the Minas Morgul road set.
And Tolkien describes it as being quite distant from Minas Morgul, but Peter needed it to be much closer, which made perfect sense, that there be a sense of menace from climbing up this cliff face mere yards away from this eerie, horrid city.
But of course the stairs just go on and on and on up this massive mountain face.
And Tolkien describes them as though they're kind of more than vertical.
This stairway did not delve into the mountainside. Here the huge cliff face sloped backwards, and the path, like a snake, wound to and fro across it. And Frodo, glancing down, saw below him as a vast deep pit, the great ravine at the head of the Morgul Valley.
So when we're wide on that, we see that as a series of model shots. But of course, various parts along the way, quite a lot of drama happens. So we built a series of set pieces.
The guys are just starting to work on the steps here. You're going to get a step thing happening all the way down.
The last set of steps that we built really were outrageous. And occasionally you'd walk through the studio to have a look what was going on, and they'd be up there halfway up the steps hacking away at the rocks and without gear on. Those boys used to give me the horrors, but boy did we make some steps.
We had a couple of sets in which we built steps which were very, very difficult to climb.
Especially when you're fat and we've got a bag and a cloak and hobbit feet on. And Elijah was in front of me, and the pointy end of the scaffold would poke me in the face all the time. I was sure I was going to lose an eye on that thing. There was lots of slipping and banging your head, and everybody associated with the movie had to endure some unique kind of suffering. And mine was those stairs of Cirith Ungol.
Shelob's Lair was a result of some workshopping and sort of dialogue that we'd had, because we'd done a lot of rock up to that point, and we had kind of exhausted a lot of our ideas about rock, and we're looking for new ideas.
And I love sandstone on the seashore because the action of the waves and the wind and the salt in the air actually erodes and eats out the rock into the most exceptional Gothic shapes. And I found the same kind of rock just out our front door in Seatoun, where the Weta workshop and the studios are. And I imagined that this marine landscape could be transposed to Shelob's Lair, where her poisonous acidity is sufficient to actually eat away at the rock and corrode it and make it this pitted surface.
But also, over the years, her body has sort of smoothed out a sort of channel where she's been dragging this great big body around.
So we incorporated as much of that as possible into the sets that we built.
The sets were incredible. I mean, these holes and halls and very creepy and twisty caverns that they had sort of created.
The set pieces we used had previously been used for the caverns below Isengard, and refoaming and reshaping a lot of the walls into this pitted environment made it quite different actually from its previous use and gave it quite a specific look.
We've got the rotten rock feel happening. It's quite prevalent in here. Obviously we're going to go for the smooth down below. That was just the sort of feel of the architecture, as it were. And then there had to be heaps and heaps of cobwebs. So we got hold of some synthetic polymer.
So it starts off like that, and then we put it in the deep fryer. So it takes about 20 minutes for it to break down into a liquid.
And you have to heat it up to 220 degrees. And if you don't get to 220 degrees, it doesn't get the right stickiness. But if you heated it to 222 degrees, it will burst into flames.
Oh yeah, that was great. The cobwebs caught fire, but our guys did everything that they could possibly have done to put it out.
So the process, was very demanding. It was always, lots of breathing apparatus and all those wonderful things.
And then you spray this stuff into cold water and you make your cobweb shape up in this water.
And what it does is it sets it, doesn't react in it, but just cools it. And it looks like a web when we stretch it.
So it's actually quite user-friendly material, really. It's got a bit of bounce to it too, which is quite nice.
So it was actually a lot of fun to be in that environment, and especially for me to be bouncing around in the web for hours at a time.
Now, of course, hobbits and humans, if you like, weren't the only animals that would be caught in this.
Yeah, well, I mean, you know, one of the things was all of Shelob's previous kills. We had a very friendly taxidermist who loaned us lots of wonderful animals that we were able to sort of hang from strings.
But we got Weta to make the corpses, the orc and urukai corpses.
He's still wriggling.
We also got the guys to boil bones and things so that we'd have skeletons to wrap up in cobwebs as well. But we'd just get the carcasses from the butcher shop.
So, you know, the sort of horror of this environment grows and grows and grows until Frodo literally falls into this rotting boneyard of half-eaten, half-preserved bodies. Cirith Ungol was originally built as an outpost for the Númenóreans to look out across Mordor and to sort of be a watchtower. But it had been overwhelmed by the orcs sometime in the distant past. And, you know, over the years, they have changed parts of it in their orcish kind of way.
The crumbling remains of the Númenórean structure are still there, but there's a whole lot of orc metal and iron that's been riveted onto it.
And then they've added all these crappy old huts out of timber and, you know, bits of leather.
So it's a great coming together of different cultures and a great opportunity, really, one of the rare opportunities we have of being inside this orcish kind of environment.
It's a great piece of design, and we were stuck on how to build a set because it needed to be quite expansive.
We had to be able to follow Sam's route from the exterior and then up various flights of stairs.
So we very cleverly designed a set that in itself was not very tall, but it had so many different stairways within it that we could keep having Sean Astin running upstairs. And he was never getting any higher, but in cutting the sequence together, we were able to make it look like he was just going higher and higher. It was actually quite a fun set to be part of.
This is my favorite set. I think this is the coolest set. I love the stairs. It reminds me of those great old Hollywood movies, you know, Errol Flynn and swashbuckling stuff and coming up the stairs and Three Musketeers. I love it.
It's just the place where the orcs and the urukai have something of a civil war.
So it was very much designed with lots of drops that stuntmen could fall down and lots of material that they could fall through.
Which was a beauty of it. I mean, as an actor and a stuntman, I mean, it's just so helpful to get into character, you know?
And then part of the defences of the original castle were these sort of troughs. This is the ball ramp. Obviously we have some big balls in there ready to roll. And if you were being attacked by someone, you could just pull out the wedge that was holding the ball in place and the ball would roll down the gutter and go crashing down, you know, 300 or 400 feet. And we've got this head of the Gondorian warrior above the hole. It was one of those lovely details that came out of sort of research into medieval castles that was never a part of the plot, but it was just part of that depth and background detail that we were able to indulge ourselves with, which is great for an art department.
The top of the tower was another set that was built, and that had the red light which Sam sees. The lamp was actually made out of Gondorian helmets, just to show that the orcs were as good at improvising with rough and ready materials as New Zealanders.
And we had that set built up off the ground so that you could have the hole with the light coming up through it, and Shagrat would fall through the hole, down he'd go. The Dimholt Road itself was shot at a place called the Pinnacles, which is about 2 hours drive out of Wellington.
The location was stunning. We helicoptered into that location, and it was this really dramatic landscape.
It's compacted sort of gravel and grit that's sort of solidified over the centuries.
And over the years, the erosion has cut through it, and it's cut these great chasms that are so unreal that you swear that they were generated, but in fact, it is a place that exists.
A seemingly lifeless place, perfect for the paths of the dead.
I know Peter knows it well because he's filmed there before.
It's a location that Pete used in one of his earliest movies, Brain Dead. So that's kind of cool, I mean, for those people that know Peter's work.
And then we shot the actual entrance of the tunnel, the Paths of the Dead itself, in the studio. But because we knew that we were shooting at the Pinnacles for the approach, we took a lot of care in matching the sort of rock formation and the rock style for the studio set that we built with the doorway. It was all done to sort of made sure that it married in very closely with what the Pinnacles look like.
It has skulls set into niches and these rough pillars which feel fairly Celtic and fairly primitive.
Then you going through that and you're into another studio set, which is where they're sort of walking down through the mountain and into the City of the Dead. The City of the Dead itself was basically miniatures and some big craggy rocks that we built in the studio. Then they burst out through the side of the mountain. We found a sort of rock formation down in Queenstown on Deer Park Heights. It had a slight crack in it and we added to it and built a sort of doorway. So our piece will end up joining in at that crevice up there. The other end joins into this rock here. Yeah, it took place in quite a few different places, but they all added together to make a fairly startling sequence, I thought.
The actual basic layout of Minas Tirith is pretty well established by Tolkien.
The fashion of Minas Tirith was such that it was built on 7 levels. Each delved into the hill, and about each was set a wall, and in each wall was a gate. For partly in the primeval shaping of the hill, partly by the mighty craft and labour of old, there stood up from the rear of the wide court behind the gate a towering bastion of stone, its edge sharp as a ship keel facing east.
And it was a matter of giving people what they'd expect to see. So the pleasure of Minas Tirith was really just in developing it and creating the detail and just making it as beautiful and as impressive a place as possible.
In our sort of early work, we'd done a lot of research, particularly architectural research, and the Minas Tirith research pretty much came out of Italy and the sort of middle of Europe.
I think Gondor really had a feeling of being the Rome of Middle-earth. So I think we were looking towards that Mediterranean end of things from the word go.
One of the influences was actually Mont Saint-Michel in France, and there's a smaller version of that called St Michael's Mount in Cornwall. And when you look at those places, when you look at Mont Saint-Michel, it's just so romantic and striking. And we tried to create a more impressive and more powerful, more ancient version of that, really.
The city of Minas Tirith was by far the most extensive set that we ever built for the trilogy. And it was always going to be a difficult set to build, not just from the construction point of view, but actually where do you put this thing?
I mean, it was just a gigantic set. It's like the largest set ever built in the Southern Hemisphere. I mean, it's huge. And it was built on the bones of Helm's Deep.
We'd already done Helm's Deep out at the quarry, and we decided that we'd utilise the remains of that set and actually design Minas Tirith around it so that we wouldn't have to clear everything out and go back to scratch.
And then out of the ashes of Helm's Deep rises a bigger set, Minas Tirith.
And it kind of fits in with the sort of approach we'd taken to Minas Tirith, which is it's this kind of ancient civilization which is built on top of a more ancient civilization. So you got this sense of layers and layers of ages and buildings. So it's quite appropriate that we're building one set on top of another set.
The actual build at the quarry was, from memory, about 6 months. So 6 months with about 100 guys.
And the art department were very clever in what parts of the city they built in the quarry to kind of mimic the physical base of some of these Helm's Deep structures.
The old Helm's Deep gates are actually the second gate of Minas Tirith.
We heightened it and we reclad the entire face of it and, of course, changed a lot of the details.
The old bit sort of curved round here, the old Helm's Deep
and this whole area was actually cut out. An archway here has been retained.
And then Minas Tirith sort of got spread out from that central piece of set.
Second gate with the inner streets, village itself is going to be in that area.
We used an area that was formerly beside the Great Hall of Helm's Deep, and we turned that into a further complex of Minas Tirith, and that's where Gandalf confronts the big Nazgul.
And we done a big tower up there, which was the old Hornburg Tower.
We craned the whole set piece down, put a dome on top of it, and that was one of the larger features of that third gate set.
And it was cool because, you know, I'd spent a lot of time at the Helm's Deep set, and it was great to then visit as it was being transformed into Minas Tirith, because you started to lose track of what had been where. It all kind of disappeared into this new city.
Minas Tirith. The Hobbit enters. So cool, eh? Looks incredible.
And it was a really awe-inspiring set because the entrance, the main door, was to scale. It was all correct. So it was huge.
The gates were huge.
Huge.
They're huge, huge doors.
Yes, the doors were, 6 to 8 metres high, I suppose.
From memory, they weighed a couple of tonne each.
But of course, we had to make them able to be opened by humans, so, you know, they were very evenly balanced.
With the main gates, just wanted to make them as decorative and impressive as possible. And the idea of having a basic wooden structure which would then be covered with bronze sculptures, it just seemed really quite appropriate.
They had all these sculpted elements, almost like the doors of the baptistry in Florence, just that kind of craftsmanship.
And the gates also had to be built twice because we had to have a broken version as well as the unbroken one.
This is one of the broken gates, and here's the other one here, just a few broken timbers, etc.
I spent quite a bit of time working on this idea for a locking mechanism which would be counterbalanced so that 2 or 3 guys would be able to pull down this big kind of wooden grid. But as you pull it down, the chains that are attached to it pull up into place another kind of bolting mechanism at the top.
So when you see those teeth go up into the rock face, that actually was a practical effect that actually worked on those doors.
Inside the courtyard within the gates, we built the very base of this big stone prow that runs up the entire height.
The prow scaffolding is in place. That's the full height of the prow that we're seeing there.
I mean, you walked up to it and you're like, oh, look. I mean, it was like this gigantic wall, and granted it was made out of polystyrene in terms of the surface, but it looked real as hell. And once you went into that main square, you were surrounded by all these buildings, and there was little streets that went off in every direction.
It was built to be deliberately like a labyrinth because we wanted to be able to shoot a whole variety of different scenes on the set, different parts of the city to make you think you were at the bottom, at the middle, at the top, you know, all over the place.
We built about 4 or 5 levels, but Pete shot it in such a way that you never saw all of them at once, and you often could rearrange a few things and shoot back down the street and create another level that way.
The art department did a really great job of always having side streets and you know, walkways. You always feel like it keeps extending beyond just the physical floor plan. You know, that's just great design.
I always think around this corner of Minas Tirith there's going to be a little pizza parlour and a jeweller's and an open-air cafe.
You could walk through the streets and lose yourself in that set. It was monumental.
We worked on great sets, and Minas Tirith was one of them, the streets of Minas Tirith, and they were truly amazing in terms of their scope and detail.
We tried to make it as convincing as possible and as much like you'd expect a medieval town to be.
I remember going to Siena years and years ago because it was a true medieval town that was very much like Minas Tirith in many ways. You know, it generations and generations and generations of people living there. But the town itself had at one stage been divided into various quarters where various trades had their own guilds, and those guilds had their own heraldic motifs that were mounted on buildings or on gateways and things like that. And we did similar sorts of things in Minas Tirith. We did, the Lampright Street being kind of a metalworking area, and we did one or two of these other kind of little heraldic things. I'm sure it would have been very difficult to pick them up on the film, but it's kind of fun to invent these insignificant details, if you like, and sort of pop them around the place to just give greater depth to things.
The detail in Minas Tirith was wonderful, and my personal favourite was up one of the side streets that you'd walk, and you'd come across this little shop, like a little store, and it was the rat catcher's place.
The rat catchers, that's right. But I mean, it's not as odd as it sounds.
There would have been a rat catcher, I guess. A place like Minas Tirith would have been riddled with the things.
These are the rat catcher's cottage up there at the foot of the wall.
It wasn't ever a deliberate decision. One of the draftsmen was interpreting a little drawing that I'd done, and he'd seen a little squiggle on the side of the door, and I don't know if I had anything in mind when I did it, but he interpreted it as a dead rat. So he decided to call it the rat catcher's cottage. And he just put that down, I think more as a joke than anything else, on the bottom of his sheet, which of course goes off to the props people. So this thing ended up on set with all these rat traps and dead rats hanging from it.
It's just one of those finer things that make the whole thing feel more real.
The detail was just tremendous, and it didn't all make it into the film, unfortunately, but it was fun to be there, I tell you. It really felt like you were walking in a strange, medieval kind of city, all built out of polystyrene and plaster and wood.
I mean, it was the kind of location that basically, if you had a visitor, everybody would be pleading, can we have pictures taken in front of that door, next to that wall? And I know we took pictures for some people and basically had to put it in the safe until the movie's released, and then, finally can give them back. But an amazing location.
One of the most impressive sets we went on, they're all impressive, but the big exterior set was the courtyard of the Minas Tirith, the palace, really.
And that we built on our backlot set at Wingate, which is also the area where we shot various other backlot sets like Osgiliath, the outside of the mines of Moria, etc. We surrounded the whole area with the stone wall that defined the shape of the top of the prow.
And we built that as a forced perspective set, so when you stood at the front of the Great Hall and looked out, you got the impression that it was going on forever. But it was about a third of its film length we built for real.
And it was a wonderful open space, and in the middle of it there was a round area, and there was the Tree of Gondor, the legendary Tree of Gondor.
It is the symbol of the unbroken line of men and of kings of men of Numenor.
The actual tree itself is a tree that basically has been a huge tree in its day, and then it's almost completely died. So basically it's to look like a tree that's had a tremendous struggle.
And I had seen these trees from the Middle East that were olive trees that date back to the time of Christ. They could be 2,000 years old, these trees, and they look almost dead. And every year these olive trees still produce fruit. So, we were thinking of it in much the same sort of way. And Alan had done some drawings of what this ancient tree could look like.
So it ended up being not a huge tree, but one that looked very, very old and convoluted. And then they took the drawing and started trying to put it together.
The process is basically we start with a steel armature, and then we attach real branches onto that, and then from there we actually build the tree up, the trunk up around the branches themselves. And in this particular case we build it up as quite a healthy tree, and then we slowly cut it away so it looks like what it is, which is a very quite badly decayed tree. So we're just basically doing the last of the carving on it, and then tomorrow it should be painted, because it is a white tree, and that helps give the impression of a tree that's very, very old, almost dead, but still just hanging on to life.
The Citadel set was almost the last set we used in the main production shoot. So we had all of our studios in Miramar full. So because it was such a large set, we really were obliged to look elsewhere for another space with a required volume we needed.
And we finally found an old wharf shed that was big enough, so we decided to build the set in there.
When I first entered most of the sets, I always had to gasp at the beauty of them. When I entered the Great Wharf set, I was awestruck for a moment, because it is massive.
It had to be, you know, almost 3 stories tall. I mean, it was just gigantic.
It's a very large space, but it was only just wide enough to contain our set. And the windows on either side were actually just a couple of feet away from the wall.
We showed Andrew Lesney, and he said, I can't get my lights in behind there. We're going to have to do something drastic here.
So we spoke to the Harbour Board and got their permission to cut holes in their concrete wall.
Great big wide concrete walls that we had to cut holes in. Unbelievable.
So they could shine lights from outside to represent the, the sunshine streaming through the windows.
The Citadel is the seat of power in Minas Tirith, but Denethor is on the throne, and the room itself has to have this slightly solemn aura, as was described in the book.
No hangings, nor storied webs, nor any things of woven stuff or of wood were to be seen in that long, solemn hall. But between the pillars there stood a silent company of tall images graven in cold stone.
In each niche there was a carved statue of one of the former kings. So it kept our team with their hands out of their pockets for another 6 months, yeah.
And it was beautiful. It was just all these kings of old all along this amazing set.
And we also used a black marble for the pillars and an alternating dark and light stone for the archways, which is kind of borrowed from Charlemagne's chapel, which is a beautiful building, very, very rich.
The detail was perfect. Everywhere you went, the detail was perfect. And so you've got this view as you walk through, and down the end is this incredible throne.
The King of Gondor's throne is at the top of a flight of marble stairs and is made of marble and is quite highly decorated.
And then down at the foot of the steps to that plinth, beside the steps, was the smaller throne, which was Denethor's throne.
Which is a much simpler kind of black stone.
Because he wasn't the king, he was only the steward, you see.
And hanging above the throne is a crown, and Tolkien describes a kind of stone canopy, but I thought that a metal crown would be quite a nice feature to have.
Which is a great symbolic gesture, really, because the crown is there, the throne is there, but the one thing missing is the figure of the king himself.
The Minas Tirith set had this great kind of feeling of age and dignity.
In fact, I couldn't keep away from it. I sort of would wander out there at weekends, and it was like walking around in some hill town in Italy.
It's that sort of magical place you go to on holiday.
A lot of good memories of Minas Tirith.
During the principal photography, we had a policy of not really building sets in the parking lot of the Stone Street studios. But the situation for pickups of Return of the King was different because we weren't able to travel to all the locations again.
Well, we had sort of a very tight schedule, and we had a lot of sets to shoot.
And so bits of those places, if they were needed for reshooting, had to come to Stone Street.
So you could walk down the parking lot at Stone Street, which now had become a back lot, and you could walk through Middle-earth.
You'd walk in there and there'd be exterior Edoras right in front of the stables.
There was bits of Orthanc.
We rebuilt 2/3 of the Golden Hall.
Just behind there was Rohan.
You'd have the Green Dragon.
There were bits of Pelennor Fields.
Then there was the other walls of Minas Tirith.
I think there was part of Mount Doom.
All of this in one parking lot.
You'd sort of turn one direction, there would be Edoras. You'd spin around 90 degrees, there would be Minas Tirith. Spin around there, there'd be the Houses of Healing. It was kind of, they were all over the place.
I could be lying down on the battlefield and see Billy and Ian doing a scene in Minas Tirith, you know? They were like a stone's throw away.
And just beyond the parking lot was some industrial warehouses, but also like there was a supermarket back there, and it's just amazing to think that like this incredible movie is being shot, and you know, you could just be going and doing your groceries and then park your car and look out the back and you could see like a Harad Tower.
Well, that's when you thought that, you know, they should have just left that there, all the stuff that was in Stone Street, and just opened a sort of, you know, Disneyland for Middle-earth.
People have said it's like a theme park. Yes, it was. It was the full Middle-earth experience.
I mean, if you'd walked in with no preparation to that, you would have thought, wow, this is really a circus. How can they possibly make sense of this?
Peter had his bikes with his name on them, and he'd get on his bike and cycle from one unit to the other.
Highly sophisticated transport mode. Very, very big budget mechanical device. Oh.
Pete would blaze by on his bicycle, you know, with a sandwich in his hand or something. Or, you know, on a cell phone sticking out of his pocket and script pages like falling out of his back pocket, and it was just completely insane.
And with the actor availability and the scheduling, we had to turn these sets around overnight in a lot of cases.
What that resulted in was this constantly changing series of sets going up and down on the back lot.
It was a fairly daunting prospect, and during that period we had a full greens team and a full construction team.
I had guys working 24 hours a day, 7 days a week.
It was a lot of very exhausted people, a lot of very blocked up situations.
There was often a few problems, like we had a huge field, and just in front of that we had the Edoras stables exterior, and we had to get the elephant onto the back set.
We've got an incredibly practiced crew at this point. Most of them have been doing this for 4 years or so. We'll go through the night and get this set up. It's this sort of 10-hour turnaround, put the old elephant in place, and no, it's going to look good.
Doing pickups is quite hard because you are trying to match something that already exists, and you're trying to match it in some cases like 2 years after the fact.
If we're going back to a set, we look at footage from the film, we look at continuity photographs, we look at construction photographs, and we've tried all the way through to keep a little piece of most sets.
But in some instances, you know, it just doesn't exist anymore, so you're actually building some stuff from scratch all over again, and in certain instances, you're actually relying on a lot of the guys' memories.
It was tricky, but it was great. You know, it's about doability, and you just say, well, can you do it? Yes, you can do it. Okay, let's do it.
And it made it quite exciting, actually. It felt like you were on a real Hollywood backlot, not a abandoned paint factory in Wellington, New Zealand.
Visually, the foundation of this movie trilogy is the design. There were incredible sets, incredible craftsmanship.
I think, like the acting, it was an ensemble piece. You know, it was everyone's energy and attention to detail and love of the project that created this fantastic result.
In one sense, there's quite a sense of relief because everyone has done their part and it's all worked.
It ended up being doable, you know. It wasn't, we didn't fall over, and we did make it look great.
And it's just great to see the Academy recognize that and give those guys the Oscar. It meant a great deal to us.
I came to realise then kind of what it meant to have worked on such a big film.
I don't know if I'd ever imagined in my life that I might win an Oscar. It's a fantastic thing and something that I'll treasure forever, along with my memories of the people that I've met. And, you know, those, I think, are probably the most precious things that I'll take away with me. The long-term friendships that I will have established while I've been here.
It just seemed to be that the journey goes all the way to the end and ends well.
That was 6 years ago that we started this, and we're still just finishing off the last few shots for the DVD, so it's been a long, very long process.
In a way, I think me going home to Devon is going to be a little bit like the Hobbits going back to the Shire, and it's right that it should be. You know, everything will fall into perspective, and I'll have my memories, and yeah, and I'll always treasure them.
It's the end of an era, really, and it has been quite a long haul.
5 years of high tension and effort and laughter and tears and, you know, stress and delight. It was a very emotional time, a good time.
When you start a film, you never set out with the intention of doing the work to garner recognition at a higher level than just the beautiful craft that you've tried to put into the film. But in the case of Lord of the Rings, of course, it has a legacy well and beyond just the process of making film.
I think as we got into the first year, it all dawned on us quite rapidly. I thought it was going to take a lot longer. Things were going to be moving a little bit slower. It was a lot bigger than we first anticipated.
There's no doubt that when we started these 3 films, Tanya and myself included, were fairly green at what we were attempting to do. It's a great tribute to Peter and New Line that they entrusted in us the level of confidence, but it required a huge amount of learning. We'd never made armies of soldiers, we'd never produced hundreds if not thousands of weapons, designing creatures and making prosthetics in mass numbers. But of course, all of it is relative to the group that you gather around you.
These guys just went, you know, beyond the pale in terms of really delivering a high level of artistry to Pete, as well as a high level of enthusiasm and love for the project. Everything was designed down to the very most minutest of details. I mean, belt buckles and arrowheads and, you know, you name it.
It's one of the real delights of working with Peter as a director is that he will take you creatively places you could never bring yourself to risk going. We appreciated that through the length of the 3 films there would be significant battles, there would be a huge amassing of these troops, this melee of action. And knowing that, we were very conscious that each culture would stand alone, be represented through their particular silhouette. We wanted the journey of that particular culture to have a plausible history. Gondor was an interesting culture to develop because Gondor was once a mighty nation. It ranged across huge lands, but that has long passed and now it's a kingless state.
By the Third Age, they've fallen from grace and they're not the power that they once were.
Their armour and their weapons have become more representative of a ceremonial process as opposed to just strict warfaring as, say, we see in the Rohan.
So I know personally when I was thinking about how you can tell that story in the armour, I was looking at Romantic era stuff for shapes and suggestions that the culture is looking back rather than looking forward.
This is the basic grunt of the Gondor. They carry quite an elaborate full-plate suit of armour. The motif on the chest is the white tree of Gondor, but now it represents the realm in decline because the state is now ruled by a Stuart instead of a king. The tree leaves are falling from the tree of Gondor.
I remember how difficult it was, how long we spent trying to make the greaves the proper shape so that basically anyone could wear them, and that they still have that elegance of shape that you have to achieve when you're making X number of suits for X number of extras who are all slightly different in size. It's very hard because you cannot indulge in the finer elements that make armor look real. It has to fit. It's like wearing a 3-piece suit, but it's made of iron. So if it's not quite right, then, you know, you can't sort of have the tailor let it out a bit.
You just think back to those guys who actually did wear all of that sort of stuff and you just think, God, who invented it? Good luck to them. Do you have Michelin here? Does that translate? The Michelin Man? The man with like, yeah, that's sort of the feel of it. Or the Stay Puffed Monster. I felt like the Stay Puffed Monster on top of a horse.
Faramir carries a similar armour, the multi-laned leg coverings, built-in hard coat so that the actor can comfortably wear it. His helmet is made in 2 pieces so that it will flip up when necessary. He carries a very simple sword at his side.
Gondorian armor was an interesting nut to crack because this is a very ancient, very powerful, very arrogant maritime nation. So there should be some reference to the sea in all this.
Tolkien describes them as having seagulls' wings on their helmets.
There's no better example than this. This is a Gondorian helmet from the Battle of Golgoroth way back at the beginning of film 1. You can see how the helmet has a feeling of antiquity because the wing blades are still removed as separate components in the overall helm. But the progression of this culture over the next 1,000 years take us to this. The helmet has become a single bowl, hand-beaten out of plate steel. The seabird's wings now are embossed out from the inside surface, making for a more efficient piece of armour. Now, going to the total extreme is the Court of the Fountain Guard. They carry these large seabird wing motif up the side of their helmet, very much the crest of their position.
Oh, they're sort of a remnant left over from when the kings ruled Gondor. They don't answer to the steward, and they protect the courtyard and the White Tree.
Aren't those winged helmets such an annoying idea? I mean, it's one of the few things, I think, in Middle-earth that is kind of at odds with this overall absolutely beautiful aesthetic.
We were trying to figure out ways to do it and make it work and make it look ancient and beautiful and graceful, but we couldn't quite nail it.
It's a little bit tricky because you immediately think of Vikings. You shouldn't even be thinking of Vikings because Vikings never had wings on their helmets.
That would have been heartbreaking to see all these Gondorians hopping about in Thor helmets, wouldn't it, with 2 silly wings nailed to the sides of their heads. That would have been awful.
So it was trying to come up with a more formal way of giving these helmets wings.
Ellen did this beautiful drawing where the feathers were sticking out ridiculously on the side of the head, and yet it worked and it looked great, so fantastic, and it looked real somehow.
I particularly like these helmets. They're as crazy as our own cultures created the ceremony that's so tied in with war.
And then you've got the Citadel Guard, which is the level in the army that Pippin joins.
These are the guys that actually always stay inside the city and fight within the city walls defending it.
This is Pippin's scabbard and utility belt. The concept being the outside wall of Minas Tirith, the 7 levels of the great city, the court of the kings, and the penetrating rock that makes up the bow that creates the city of Minas Tirith.
Then we come to the helmet. Not my favourite. Sorry, people of Weta.
The initial rendering of Billy's helmet was hilarious because it was the Gondorian helmet with the silver kind of nipple at the top, but then it had black feathers on either side.
Completely out like that. And I honestly thought I was on some sort of candid camera.
The helmet was like this big. It looked like, you know, like something that Cher might wear to the Academy Awards.
But there was another helmet, and even Ian didn't like it because when he's holding on to the front of his horse, he's got this helmet up to about here. This pointed helmet. Get out.
Down to the lower level, quick!
So, you'll notice in the movie, I ripped that helmet off quite a lot, you know, because it's truthful for the scene.
Pete likes armor, and I remember that for the Black Gate, he wanted me to be all armored up for that, and I said, you know, because of the way he's set up as a ranger, and that transition, it wouldn't seem right to suddenly be all like a tank. You know what I mean? It just didn't feel right. And the other thing is, I knew I was going to have to be running around on the ground and fighting people and stuff, and I said, it's much better and it's more in keeping with Aragorn's style to go helmetless and no gloves.
We did talk about a heavy armour, you know, for the Black Gates, but it just doesn't fit who Aragorn is in the films.
It was quite heated for a little while there about which way to go.
What was wanted was a look for him to say, I'm not the king yet, but I'm stepping up to lead this army, and I really have cast off the last remnants of who I was.
The reconciliation of that was to go to a leather coat that had the Tree of Gondor embroidered on it. Once again, like Faramir, we incorporated the White Tree of Gondor, but in this instance, it was embroidered, and this was added a little extra difficulty to it.
But for the coronation, it had to be something special.
Peter really wanted Viggo to be in armour, so the final scene was where we brought back the armour for the coronation.
The armour I'm wearing is the armour of my forefathers. old armor that I think you see in the prologue.
We used as much of Elendil's armour as we possibly could. The idea that this armour had been rescued from the battlefield, and in the same way that the Royal Guard have maintained their vigil protecting the tree, somewhere resting in state is the trappings of the royal family.
Quite elaborate, but quite ceremonial, carrying the stars of Gondor, the bird's wings, the carefully engraved motifs, once again all originally made out of plate steel.
I think there was a certain maturity in the way the design team worked, and I thought the variety of designs that were done for the Gondorian armor was very effective. I thought it was enchanting in a number of ways.
A very beautiful suit of armour to look at. It's got lovely lines and, you know, a lot of work went into designing that particular style.
The Haradrim went through a few different design phases. We even locked in on them and then had it changed on us.
All that Tolkien says is flashes of golden red. Flash of golden red as they trample past, and we know they're from the south, which is hotter. So I went, oh, golden red, cool. Everything else is kind of monochromatic blacks and greys and browns. Good chance to get some good rich colours in. So I developed ways of making fake tiger skins, the whole skins, and leopard skins, and lion skins, and zebra skins. I started collecting feathers to be dyed. And Philippa Boynes, the writer, came down and went, hang on, you can't make them look African. That would just be rude. Yet another race of bad guys, you know, with dark skin.
We didn't want to draw too heavily from any one particular culture, for obvious reasons. This is Middle-earth, and also you don't want to insult anybody. These are bad guys after all.
So I did some more research and thought, okay, the only races that I can pull on are a small island called Kiribati, who are so small that I don't think I'm insulting them to plagiarise the way they make their armour, which is they weave all their armour out of wicker. And then I added that to the Aztecs, who have no metal technology, but they have massive amounts of gold and turquoise. And to that I've added ivory because, let's face it, they've got giant elephants.
So what we ended up with the Haradrim was a culture that I think is far more unique and far less recognisable.
These wicker-made suits of armour, reinforced with shaped bamboo, elements of the Aztec culture being woven into it through semi-precious stones, selective pieces of gold plating.
We also gave them animal fetishes. Like they bring the power of the beast onto themselves by adorning themselves in beast tokens.
Their technology is very much one from fighting from the back of a large creature, as say the way that real elephants are used in our world. They mostly use spears and bows, bows that are built out of long antlers, very strong poundage on the bows to fire short little bamboo arrows from these bamboo quivers down into the enemy. So once again, the gold motif with little tiny Aztec illustrations of characters in battle running around the bottom of them.
Also, you see some Haradrim who are driving the elephants, and we thought we'd have a bit of fun with these guys. So we went to town with them with body painting, scarification, tattooing.
The joy of something like this is that you actually invent this whole scenario of how they make their stuff. You know, you don't just go, oh, they're Harad, there you go. The way to make them special and fantastic is to actually come up with an entire culture to back up any questions about them.
In the case of the orcs, it was an interesting journey with these characters because in film 1 and film 2, we played them as much more of a sort of a rabble, this sort of schoolyard bully, the rats of the battlefield. They have clad themselves in armour that they've scrounged and picked up off the corpses of their enemies and patched these together with bits of fabric and finery, but it's all rotted away and dirtied down.
The orcs were one of the big problems of Return of the King, partly because we created a reasonably formidable force of opposition for the Helm's Deep sequence. And the Uruk-hai, by their nature, were much tougher and stronger and more brutal, and they worked quite well. And the very first cut that we ever saw of Return of the King, it was one of the weakest things in the movie with the orcs.
I just think that ape-like thing looks just... I just don't like the look of it. It looks just a little... It looks a little like people are trying too hard to look like apes.
They'd unfortunately been trained, the extras and stunt people have been trained to walk in this bow-legged monkey walk. which I called the full diaper walk because it looked like, but they just looked like kids with full diapers, basically, the way that they were trotting around, and they were anything but scary.
So he came to us and said, look, I realise now that for the final battles, the orcs now need to take on a more intimidating and focused perspective. In fact, we even need characters within the armies of the orcs that become the antagonists that I can focus on and separate out from the masses.
The brief on the new orcs was your kind of uber orcs. These were actually Sauron's orcs.
It was really the idea of they're not a new breed, they're not Uruk-hai, but they are the best orcs. And they've lived and been trained in Mordor as an army.
So we went back to the drawing board, and basically what we did is we had literally hundreds and hundreds of photos and drawings of all of the orc makeups that we did, and he wanted to see them all. So what we did is we got them all, stuck them on this huge, huge board, and we put numbers by them all.
And you could just go and go, oh, I'll have a bit of that, and a bit of that, and that's really cool, and that's not physically possible, so... But maybe if we changed that a bit, and you could actually cobble together other people's cool ideas.
That's our favourite one there. The orcs are all going to have individualised helmets and armour, and their faces are all different.
He'd check each ones that he really, really liked, and then from there, he says, yep, this is what I don't want. He says, I don't want any witchy-poo noses. So witchy-poo noses was the thing.
I guess it was sort of a long, extended nose. So we sort of went for something a bit more skeletal on the new breed of Mordor orcs.
Their faces, they were supposed to be just really, really hard. They were supposed to feel a little more lived in and kind of diseased. I mean, they are a lot stronger, but they've just been corrupted by this malice for so long. They have just little bits of rot and stuff all over them.
Their new looks, we also gave them an upgrade with armor, armor design as well. So the guys at the workshop designed all this new, really kind of cool armor.
So the whole idea was plate steel, but it's all the curves have been sharpened and filed, so they're all like shears and secateurs, and if you get near to this armour, it'd be enough to lose fingers.
Orcs are like a box of chocolates. You don't know what you got until you open one.
I think it helped to actually make them into a more credible and fearsome fighting force.
Another big failing with the orcs was that they had no commander. We had Sauron in his tower and we had the Witch King, but we had nobody on the battlefield sort of telling the orcs what to do. And so we created a character who was only referenced by name once or twice in the book, and that's the character of Gothmog, played by Lawrence McCory.
First question was, what is a Gothmog? What is it? Oh, no one's told you yet? Oh, no. He's actually an orc. I went, an orc? In the first movie I played an Uruk-hai. They stand tall. Orcs were the little ones. I mean, how am I going to play an orc when I'm 6'4"?
We picked Lawrence because he had played Lurtz in the Fellowship of the Ring, and he'd done such a great job about projecting all this energy and aggression through this thick rubber prosthetics that he had to wear. That we couldn't think of anybody better, and we thought, well, the great thing with prosthetics is you can design a completely different face and still stick it on the same guy, and you're never going to recognise him.
Bill Hunt beautifully sculpted Gothmog.
I put just a spot of rot on the side of his nose, in addition to some of the callous stuff that we were doing on some of the others. And I was afraid that the rot was going to be a bit much.
I looked at that and I thought, God, we should use this, but go way, way beyond this. In fact, we should do a John Merrick.
And he basically says, a bit more like the Elephant Man. It's like, what? So like take it in, a bit more in here, and he grabs like a big chunk of plastic and he starts packing it on. It's like, okay.
We always like to think these days that we can preempt Pete's excesses to a certain degree. But sure enough, when Pete comes in for his design meetings, he's there with the big chunks of plasticine and mushing it on and pushing it around with a heat gun and squashing it.
He goes off to a meeting with Richard just after that. And like 10 minutes later, I'd take an entire block of plasticine and just crumpled up into balls and just packed it onto the side of this thing. It's like, okay, I want to get to a point where he's going to say, all right, that's too far, now pull it back. And next time he saw it, he said, yeah, that's great. So, okay, well, we'll put texture over the top and call it done.
You get an early morning call, and you're still tired from, waking up so early, and then you sort of like fall asleep, like that.
He'd sleep in the chair, and he'd have hours of makeup done.
If you're going to be...
He always seemed to be suffering from lack of sleep because he had to arrive on set at 4 in the morning and then sit inside all this latex. I've got this great photo of him sound asleep in a wheelbarrow,
all hanging over the edges of this wheelbarrow off, tucked in behind his shed. And when it was time for him to do his thing, we'd either wake him up or drag him out of the breakfast tent or wherever he'd wandered off to.
Stand here, Lawrence. Where? Just down here. That way? Which way?
And send him off, and you wouldn't undress him again until the end of the day.
That's right. He's fantastic. He looks really great. In the film, he comes riding in on his ward. Just looks like a John Wayne kind of character. Comes riding in on his horse. He's just turned out to be a really cool character, and he's featured in the film quite a bit.
What of the wizard? I will break him.
Another decision we made was to redesign the Witch King, which when I say redesign the Witch King was really his helmet.
John Howe was a big influence on the original helmet design. I did a lot of drawings and sculptures based off the helmets you see in his paintings, which are these very tall bucket, sort of round helmets with the crown of spikes on the top.
But was just too similar to, just looked a little bit too similar to Sauron.
Even people who had worked on the films who hadn't read the book, when they saw footage, thought, does Sauron show up at the battle, doesn't he?
You fool. No man can kill me. Die now.
I think at the end of the day, it was too removed from the Black Riders we'd seen in film 1.
What we came to realise was that in some way we needed to pay design homage back to the wraiths on the horses. So Warren Mahi threw his great sensibilities into it.
I remember Pete saying that he wanted to have a big tall spike that got bigger and bigger and bigger. And if the original designs had small spikes around the outside that got bigger as well. And he wanted the whole face to feel quite long and, in a sense, resemble the Black Riders. He wanted you to think that underneath that helmet was the hood as well.
You take out eyes.
Start the first move, but obviously don't swing it. We'll just cut it. I like the spikes. The spikes somehow evoke the crown of thorns. I don't know what that means, but it kind of he has this ring of spikes, and he just I think the helmet design is really cool actually, and I'm glad that we did it. And it gives him his own specific character and personality. In addition to the helmet, we redesigned his mace.
We had made a mace for the Witch King.
And I looked at the first one that they built and I just said, it's okay, but we need to make it bigger.
Okay, so we made it bigger. And Pete came back and said, no, I need it bigger again. So we made it bigger. And everybody's going, oh my God, this thing's getting huge. It's totally impractical now.
You need a big wrist.
Well, it went from impractical to ridiculous. I mean, this thing was huge.
And I'm like, hey guys, I'm embarrassed to take this on set. I'm going to get laughed off set. This is so ridiculously large.
Oh, Andrew.
Yeah. And so I sort of hid it under my jacket as I walked through all the armour techs onto set so I didn't get a ribbing. And I went up to Pete and I said, look, Pete, this is what we've come up with for the Witch King. Pete gets it. He's flaying it like this. He gets one swing, and then the handle catches in his lapel, and the momentum, he's going around. It's so funny, and it nearly flips him over, and it hits the ground, and it's caught in his jacket. And it's like, you don't think the head's just a little bit too excessive, do you? And he goes, well, I was actually thinking it's about 50% too small, and I'm like, oh no, please.
It ended up being this enormous cast iron spiked thing.
Some people call it a mace, some people call it a morning star.
Oh God.
Either way, I ended up calling it damned heavy, because it was damned heavy.
It ended up being so large that you actually couldn't pick it up.
Right. And so I'm lying on my back in the scene, and I'm lifting it up into camera shot for him.
Once again, faith in Pete. When you finally see it in the movie, it is ludicrously large, but it works because it's ludicrously large. I mean, you see that thing, and you see the look on Eowyn's face when she sees it. She's terrified.
I don't think it jars anyone out of the moment. I don't think it stops people to think, God, that's a little daft. I think they just accept it as a piece of Peter Jackson's storytelling.
The Mouth of Sauron was a difficult character because you don't quite know what he is. Is he a human being? Is he an orc? I mean, in the book it seems like he's some sort of human in service of Sauron, like a quisling, like a traitor, a treacherous sort of turncoat.
The rider was robed all in black, and black was his lofty helm. Yet this was no ring-wraith, but a living man. The lieutenant of the Tower of Barad-dûr he was, and his name is remembered in no tale, for he himself had forgotten it, and he said, "I am the Mouth of Sauron."
Richard's guys at Weta designed an interesting idea for a helmet, which was a helmet that didn't really have eyes or eye holes.
Fantastic design by Warren. It's kind of half warrior, half priest, quite disturbing.
I'd been there long enough at Weta, and I mean this in the best possible way, for Richard Taylor to pigeonhole me into evil guys. I mean, that's fine. I mean, I love that. I love that. That's cool. So we talked a lot about the fact of, is he just an envoy for Sauron? Is he like a diplomat? Or is there some type of feed which is directly Sauron speaking? It was actually Ben Whitten who said, oh, well, what if he's actually blind? And so that's how the helmet was brought about. You know, we totally covered up his eyes.
No, that's not talked about in the book. There's no mention of whether his eyes are covered or not, but yet I think it's really cool. I mean, when I saw it, I thought, oh yeah, why not? That's a really nice idea.
And then this evil mouth, the idea that every time he spoke, his language was so evil that it would crack the lips or the skin of his face.
Mike Asquith sculpted this appliance, and this appliance was just a very, very subtle gelatin appliance that had all these splits in the makeup.
We actually tried to do it in such a way that the splits would actually open, and as he articulated, the splits would open and close.
We knew they were going to do it a little bit, but we didn't realize it was going to be that much. And it was just like, it was pretty creepy and pretty gross.
When Pete told us who he had cast for the Mouth of Sauron, we were really buzzed because we really enjoyed Bruce Spencer's character out in Mad Max, the gyrocopter pilot, this nutty guy.
And so we did this makeup on Bruce, and I remember Bruce saying, he says, oh, what did I ever do to Peter? I said, you're not going to see anything of me in this. And all you saw was just this little mouth with these dentures going, what did I ever do to Peter?
I've never been so submerged in costume, makeup, and masks, etc., as I have been in this. I've got a cold sore that's obviously gone wrong. I haven't been taking my antibiotics.
He had a hell of a time because we were shooting at Ruapehu and his horse was misbehaving and he was blind. I mean, he couldn't really see anything.
My masters, Sauron the Great, bid thee welcome.
We said, well, you're going to have to ride the horse up and stop it on this mark on the ground. And he couldn't see the mark and he was totally blind.
I think these days, to be a fully fledged actor, you've got to learn to ride.
And I never really thought much about the Mouth of Sauron again for years because we were working on the other movies, and then we got the footage out and we started cutting it together, and I kind of thought that people would be disappointed by it.
My masters, Sauron the Great, bid thee welcome.
And I somehow thought that, the prosthetics look fine and the design is fine, but surely there must be something else we can do to make this character a bit more kind of memorable.
Pete decided that he just, he wanted something a little bit different looking. He just wanted to make him look a bit more scarier.
I then experimented with the idea of taking the mouth, which is obviously horizontal, and just simply cutting it out of the image and turning it sideways so it becomes a vertical mouth. You know, like it's there and it's sort of talking. And I thought that would be interesting. I was just trying to think of something that would make him unique and memorable. And so they did a test for me of the vertical mouth.
My masters, Sauron the Great.
Some of the tests looked really weird and just really creepy.
But again, it was going to take quite a lot of time.
Pete decided, no, let's not do that. Let's just keep what we had. But basically what Weta Digital did is that they kept our original makeup, but they enlarged it by about 200%, I think it was.
My master, Sauron the Great, bids thee welcome.
And it's really weird. I mean, I was really pleased with the way that the effect worked because it gives you this uneasy sense that something's weird. I like it. It's one of those slightly subtle but sort of disturbing effects.
The Army of the Dead was something that we got very excited about early on. I mean, all makeup effects guys want to do zombies at some point in time, and, you know, hey, we're like everyone else, and we were quite keen to do some zombies.
The Army of the Dead date from the same period as, the Battle of the Last Alliance, but where exactly they come from in Middle-earth, I'm not quite sure. I think we wanted them to feel more ancient and a little bit more exotic.
Warren Mahi hit upon some great ideas for them, and his armour designs became really the basis for what we see in the Army of the Dead.
A lot of the breastplates were quite ribcage-like, and a lot of the armour was splinting down the arms of metal, so it sort of mimicked the corpse or the skeleton that was underneath it.
Some of the icons that we brought in for the Army of the Dead was a lot of parallel vertical lines and a lot of circles.
For one of the armies itself, I actually thought I liked their armour, one of the best, I guess, because it looked a little bit more, I suppose, from a highly sophisticated race of people that had disappeared off Middle-earth.
But nothing had been done on the actual King of the Dead himself. And Peter wanted him to obviously stand out from the crowd a little bit.
We came up with this idea that we would have the King of the Dead filmed in prosthetics where he would look a little bit rotten. You know, you'd still see his nose and his skin and his lips and everything else. And we would morph between that and a digital version of him, which was much more skull-like. It was his sort of underskull and some sort of sinew and things.
There would be a very elegant transition from the actor and the prosthetics to this underlying decrepit skull underneath that would have to be all CG and animated and tracked to the actual actor.
And then the compositor was blending backwards and forwards between what we called the stage 1 and the stage 2. The stage 1 being the green screen element, and the stage 2 being this digital skull with skin.
Depending on his emotions, we base it on his mood. So if he was trying to be angry and make a point or be threatening, the skull would sort of thrust forward into prominence. And then if he was more settled and just sort of being more relaxed, you would see more of his rotten kind of skin.
Now, of course, we were designing all this, and then someone sort of came into the room and said, "Hey, you know this Army of the Dead stuff, the King of the Dead stuff?" I went, "Yeah." And Randy, she said, "Have you seen the trailer for Pirates of the Caribbean?" I went, "No." I said, "You should take a look at it." We're like, oh.
They did something the same kind of thing. It's like, oh, damn, they already did something like that.
Just when I thought we had a good idea, somebody else has gone and done something similar to that.
Their stuff was cool. I mean, it's beautiful and it's different. I think that's the good thing, is our stuff that we've done is different, and both are very beautiful. It's a cool look. It's good to see some zombies in a movie again.
That line was broken. It has been remade.
I think potentially what's happening is that the head is almost overweighted the body now, so it becomes top heavy, therefore not giving the might to the upper body.
Remember the first day I was here, Richard Taylor saying to me that it has to be a mix of an alternative reality, that you can believe things actually did happen. I think that helped us a lot with how we came to the designs or the ideas that we did. We'd imagine that it could belong in the world that we live in now, especially the creatures.
Great horns she had, and behind her short, stalk-like neck was a huge swollen body, a vast bloated bag swaying and sagging between her legs. Its great bulk was black, blotched with livid marks, but the belly underneath was pale and luminous and gave forth a stench.
It's said that Tolkien, in his very early life, when he was in South Africa, was actually badly frightened by a tarantula spider. And it's possible that this stayed in his mind forever, because dangerous spiders are very much part of his whole run of stories.
Scary spiders are interesting because I guess different people have different concepts of what they should look like. I mean, I'm genuinely scared of spiders, and so, you know, everything that frightens me about spiders is kind of natural. It's not exaggerated, and it's not sort of a science fiction-y kind of stylization. It's just real spiders doing what they do normally. And I felt that Shelob shouldn't really be much more than that, other than the fact that she's big.
Shelob was a huge group effort, being a character that had to be completely convincing.
Guts of it is, we've got to always remember that a lot of the time we've got to appreciate Shelob from a Hobbit-type perspective.
Peter wanted a lot of work done on it, a lot of research done on it, a lot of reference provided to get it just right. It had to be like Gollum. Gollum had to be able to act and emote. Shelob had to be able to really scare people. And so we started with real spiders.
We sort of looked at things like tarantulas and hunting spiders. Pete's an arachnophobe, so Shelob became the spiders he hates the most.
One spider in particular that used to terrorize me, or still does, but particularly when I was a kid, I used to go under my parents' house and dig in the ground under the basement, and I used to make little roads for my corgi toys. and was when I was 5 or 6 years old. And there's a spider that lives in those sorts of basements in New Zealand called a tunnel web, and it like lives in little holes, and it loves rotten wood, and it has these very thick webs. And sometimes you dig around and you come across a nest of one. And I remember under my parents' house, it used to terrify me. I always loved playing there, but I was terrified of coming across the tunnel webs.
And he wanted Shelob to resemble this spider. And Christian, who's also not too happy with spiders, actually went out and found one in the garden.
And brought it in to show it to Peter, and, you know, he sort of wouldn't let me get closer than 5 feet with it. But this thing was like 4 times bigger than I was expecting to be when I sort of managed to hook it out of the wall. It's like, oh, crikey.
So for a while, there was this live tunnel web at Weta, which was forming the part of the design process of Shelob.
The body had this sort of soft, sponge-like feel to it. So some of those elements were brought into the Shelob design.
But her face was something that was slightly unattainable. We had designed some faces for Shelob, but they really weren't working for Pete.
She had a far more spider-like face, originally.
That was tough, because once you start enlarging a sort of a microscopic spider face, they tend to not look quite that scary.
Shelob went through design derivation after design change and looking for something that was really intimate in Peter's mind, something really special that he could see that we hadn't yet found. And he pushed us and he pushed us.
Peter wanted something ever so slightly human about it, that you could look at the spider and see it was looking straight back at you.
I wanted to somehow capture the feeling of Shelob being sort of ancient and evil and very sick, sort of psychologically sick. So I wanted her face to look like she'd been struck with a sort of a paralysis and had fungus growths on her head and all this sort of stuff.
The general brief was just make her nasty. She's a sick, diseased demon spider. Make her a lot more malignant and growth-ridden, almost as though you can smell her.
And so a lot of sculptures had been done to the point that Pete and Fran had, just like, okay, there's just so many here. How do we pick one? And apparently Pete and Fran's children picked the one. It was the one that they thought was the grossest looking. And that became the Shelob design, which, hey, what better way to choose?
I think it really comes together in that really low shot where we crane right down below Frodo and Shelob is right over his head, getting closer and closer and closer.
Everything that I hate about spiders, I really wanted to get into that Shelob scene. It was actually a very personal scene for me and a lot of fun. At the beginning of 2003, Alan Lee had a suggestion for us, which was to create a new creature.
It occurred to me that we really only have one new creature in the Return of the King, and that's Shelob. And Tolkien had mentioned that his siege engines and machines of war were dragged across the Pelennor fields by great beasts.
Grond they named it, in memory of the hammer of the underworld of old. Great beasts drew it, orcs surrounded it, and behind walked mountain trolls to wield it.
And we don't know what these great beasts are, and Tolkien never gave us any more detail.
So there was an opening there. There was an excuse to actually introduce one of these characters. So I did a drawing in the sketchbook, which I quite liked, and showed to Peter.
And Peter, being such a visual person, I think seeing that went, oh, well, that's great, we've got to do that.
And then I had to sort of show it to everyone at Weta Digital in a meeting. And there was a little bit of surprise there, the fact that I'd already shown it to Peter.
That was sprung on Digi at the 11th hour, and there was some pretty shocked faces, knowing it was PJ approved and that it had to be done.
Alan shows up one day with this whole new creature. I mean, it's like, yeah, it looks really cool, Alan, but we don't have any time to do any of this anymore.
And we were like, oh my God, here's a whole another creature this late in the day.
He said, well, you got to have the great beast, again, being a true Tolkienite. And he has a way of sort of telling you, it's like, okay, all right, again, it's partly, I don't want to fight anymore about any of this. It's like, whatever, pile up high enough, put it on the top.
So the idea of making the great beasts was something that was put into everybody's mind at the beginning of the year, and Richard Taylor and his team worked with Alan on designing what this creature might look like.
Interestingly enough, when Jamie Bestwarrick came to actually sculpting the maquette for it so that Weta Digital could scan it and animate the creature, he used a lot of prehistoric reference, and there is actually a creature that bears a striking resemblance to the great beast that did actually exist.
A large mammal known as brontops, which worked out quite well because it was almost proportionately the same, right down to the beginnings of what could have been a horn on the front of the head. It's great working off Alan's design because it was so anatomically correct. It's always a joy to work from because it's incredibly accurate.
Then that was scanned, and it didn't take too long really to put that into effect and get the creature working.
It's a nice little treat, really. It just comes out of nowhere, and there it is, and it's gone again. The great beasts. We always wondered what they looked like, and now we know.
Peter came up with this amazing concept of this mama kill charge, and it's just so awe-inspiring, and that was great. But then he was like, you know what, we need to have like a physical dead mama kill, you know, in some of these scenes.
You know, all this stuff sort of happens digitally. You know, we obviously don't have giant mama kills.
So Pete came and asked if we could possibly build a life-size dead mama kill for the Battle of Pelennor as a backdrop for some of the shots.
I don't know why, but Richard put his hand up and said, yep, we'll do that one. That sounds challenging.
This sounded cool, and a hell of a cool opportunity that wasn't to be passed up.
And of course, we only had something like 3-4 weeks at the max to do this, and it was a huge, huge sculpture.
I always get a kick out of, you know, how these things unfold. You know, a quick sentence out of Peter like, yeah, we need a dead mama kill for the shot, means a hell of a lot. It's quite a big undertaking.
So I had Jason pour me up a plasticine replica out of this maquette. It stood about this big. And before the plasticine fully cooled, I got him to very carefully take it out of the silicon. And then I took this soft, perfectly sculpted plasticine mamakill, raised it above my head and slammed it down on the lino. And to everyone sort of, oh, you know, what the hell are you doing? But in the process, it squashed onto its side and almost perfectly melded into the correct position of a massive creature that had fallen over.
Before we knew it, there was this giant mamakill lying dead in our studio.
A whole team of sculptors attacked it with chainsaws, grinders, and began to surface it down and put the detail in, sculpting the eyes, the toenails, the tusks.
And all you could see was poly everywhere. And you know, for me, I used to think, oh no, how are we going to get rid of all this waste? I mean, polystyrene's the hardest thing to throw away because it takes up so much space in your rubbish truck.
One day they had it all assembled, just sort of pushed all the pieces together. Wow! It was big.
That thing was so cool. It was enormous. If you stood next to one of the feet, the height of a man was only the width of this thing's soul.
Probably the biggest problem we faced with that particular miniature, and God, can you call it a miniature, was actually moving it.
Well, luckily the girl falls apart. She comes in bits.
We sliced it up, put it onto trucks. I think it took 12 trucks.
I think it was 11 articulated trucks.
I think somebody said 18 flat deck trucks.
It was a lot of house removal trucks.
So that all went through Wellington in the middle of the day. The public quite liked seeing elephant bits sailing through the city.
John Harding supervised these huge cranes that lifted the different pieces and rebuilt this elephant on location.
This is the mamakill, or oliphant, as legend calls them. And this is how big they are. It was said we couldn't do it. So Richard, being who Richard is, said, yes, of course we can do it. We can do anything. I think it took me a week the first time to put it all together and get all the arrows. There's 600 arrows embedded in the side, and there's 5 spears and an awful lot of blood coming out of an awful lot of wounds.
This is the largest single prop in the world to be built for a film.
When we turned up on set, and I turned to Pete, and I, as I try and always do, and said, are you happy with it? He sort of gave me a look as if to say, I think it could have been a lot bigger. And in Mr. Jackson fashion, I think he would have liked it to be a little bit bigger, as would we all. But ultimately, there are compromises occasionally to make sure you deliver on the dates. And you can get it through the door, of course, and under the trolley lines. As they finished their filming on the location, Weta Workshop and Weta Digital collaborated and we threw a huge picnic.
All the families came, so the kids were all running around and climbing up on top of it.
Anya, I want to thank you all obviously for coming out here. It's a very special occasion. This is obviously the most people that have ever worked at Weta at the moment, which is quite an incredible thing. And obviously all the families that have joined us as well.
And we ended up having our crew photographs sitting on top of the Mamakill.
It was unbelievable, actually. It was kind of bizarre. We all went out for a picnic and it was there in the field, dead.
It was a good family atmosphere. We had the barbie going and a few tinnies.
I'm wearing a stupid hat waving and I'm standing on the Mamakill's butt.
That really was our crew photo, you know, all in front of this great big elephant that was lying out there in the middle of Paraparam, and it was quite surreal.
It was a very cool day and a good way to see out the Mamakill. People often ask me whether I regret the fact that I never get to do a great amount of the art anymore. And although I do regret it at some level, what you replace with the hands-on opportunities is to watch other people creatively grow with their incredible talent.
Everyone there has been incredibly generous with their knowledge and with their skills and with the techniques, and that's the only way that I've learned. I was incredibly lucky.
To be on what is essentially one big film for so long, and for it to be the kind of project that the entire crew cares about and that everybody intimately is invested in at an emotional level, I think that's very, very rare in the film industry.
It became such a big family, and this common thing that we all shared together was the making of these movies, and I think that was something incredibly special and something that, you know, I'll always cherish.
Probably the best times were always when we're all going for it together. The production office often used to come and tell us to shut up or calm down because we were laughing so much, and Richard used to wander through and say, "Are you guys actually doing any work?"
You wake up, well before the sun, and you create a monster every morning.
You get there with the unit people and the transport people who drive everything in. And everyone goes home and everyone gets wrapped, and you're still there wiping up the bus and shaking a hobbit foot snot out of the feet.
It's hard to explain to somebody just exactly what it was like. It's a very surreal thing, but it's like, it happened. Middle Earth was a real place. We were there.
It is so amazing to experience what it has meant to so many people. What's really neat is that you discover that it's meant as much to these people as it felt to us, being part of it. This 7 years of our lives, this relationship that we've had with Peter Jackson making these films and with the whole crew, have been, without question, the most impacting and wonderful time that we've ever had in our lives.
Well, they are just the most incredible group in the world. We could never have come home. We've just gone and collected these for them, so yay to that.
What are you going to do for the rest of the day?
Well, we're going back to work.
One of the things that comes from Tolkien are challenges, and one of the challenges of Lord of the Rings is the thousands of horses that we had on screen.
When you read The Lord of the Rings, you know these horses are also characters in these films, and they're not just sort of props, if you will. Anything from small moments to incredible large charges, horsework is found throughout the trilogy and is a major part of the making of these films.
Shadowfax is the lord of all horses and has been my friend through many dangers.
We had two Shadowfax horses, two white stallions. One was called Blanco, another called Domiro.
Domiro was the principal Shadowfax and a diva.
That's how he lets you know he's a stallion.
Domiro looked magnificent and seemed to know he did, and was trained to getting exactly in the right position and to holding it.
Get over. Get over. Whoa. If I want him to stand somewhere, I put him on a mark. That way I can walk off and leave him on his mark. Mark. Whoa. Mark. Whoa. Boy.
And when he did it magnificently, and when he didn't do it, he had to be sent back to the stables, and Blanco,
Boy.
who'd been watching every move of Domiro, stepped in and without any problem at all did it.
Okay, get on your mark. Get on it, get on it, get on it. It's quite a unique thing for a horse to be able to run to a mark because it's only a small object out in the paddock, and a lot of people just wouldn't think a horse would have the intelligence to do it, but it's quite amazing how easily they pick it up and how well they learn it.
Beautiful stuff. I don't think there was anyone in New Zealand who could have got the horses to do that. We were lucky we had Don Reynolds and Graham Ware, who's a very, very good horse trainer.
It's called liberty training. Basically because the horse is at liberty, he's free from restraints. Dig it. Atta boy, good boy, get up here. Whips are used purposely as a direction. They're not used in the true sense of whips. We use one as a guide pretty well to point the direction we want to go, and one as impulsion, which is just to give the horse a little bit of impulsion as far as just giving him that forward driving motion. Change it, Blanco. Change, change. Good boy, good. Blanco, he's a white Andalusian, enjoys his work and does it fairly well. Up high, up high, up high, up high. Good boy, come up here. Good boy.
And they trained Shadowfax in the technique of liberty riding. And then we needed a rider that was really good. And we had this great rider from New Zealand, Basil Clapham, who looked enough like Gandalf to double the inn.
Do beware that you're not meant to have any stirrups or bridle or saddle, and but boy, can he ride a horse.
He was doing stuff that I would never do. He was riding a horse with no saddle, no bridle, with a wire that came around its neck that you couldn't see that he would hold on to.
It's my lifeline.
It's a speed control, but sometimes it don't work.
No, sometimes it definitely don't work. As you could well find out in the next shot.
Basil had the hardest job of anybody in terms of horse work in this movie. I have a picture of him sitting in the lunch tent, looking so sad and so tired and so red-eyed. And people just see the movie and just say, wow, Gandalf, awesome, but they don't realize what goes into something like that.
We've just passed into the realm of Gondor!
Preparing for all the battle scenes and everything was quite intense with the horse training.
We get a horse on a film, we go through a desensitising period, which is exposing the horse to all the different things that happen to him around a film set, and which is not so much everyday life.
Well, we're using like blue tarps as like desensitizers and bags hanging down so that the horses just get used to the madness that happens on set.
Some of the horses were quite raw, shall we say. They weren't experienced in the things that they needed to be for the work that was going to be asked of them.
Originally, there was a horse being trained up for Aragorn. I mean, basically, they would try to do these training sessions where he'd get down completely on his belly so that Aragorn could sort of get on top of him, and then he'd rise up. And they start off training with a dummy for that.
Hopefully he won't lie on top of him on the day.
We had to get rid of that horse for that specific role, and Uraeus was brought in and trained up and learned things very quickly.
He was a last-minute replacement, just like I had been, So a day or two before, I'm suddenly introduced to this new horse who's never been on a movie set. It's very physically strong and strong-minded as well. And he did kind of freak out the first day, It was very difficult for him. We got the shots, but I don't think he was very happy, and I felt bad about it, for him,
It reminds you how solid the horses had to be for battle, And he's going very well, very well.
About the second time we had to do something on film, he was really looking for the camera, it seemed like, and showing off and rearing and doing things, but in a more controlled way, which was great, but kind of surprised from not liking it at all the first time. The second time, he couldn't get enough of it, and hated having any other horse between him and the camera.
A funny thing, I actually wanted to get a camera and shoot a documentary of the horses and ask them what they thought about being on the film.
I still think he likes the Kit Kats best, but he'll settle for toffee pops.
It was kind of tricky not to treat these horses as being special and these ones not, because there were definite personalities. There was Florian, he was the white stallion, and he had a brood of black geldings. They were his brood, and whenever he was around them, he became incredibly, this is my brood, you know, these are my people, don't mess with them.
He is special, and he knows he's special, you know, he's just, yeah, personality plus. Because he's a stallion as well, he's got a huge amount of presence, and I was just like, oh, look at that.
The stallions we had to keep separate anyway because they hated each other.
There was one day that Urias was really going crazy, and, you know, he ruined several takes, and then between takes I had to separate him. And it turned out there was a mare in season that he was trying to get to, but it's not just a question of wanting the girl, it's wanting to kill all the guys before getting to her. So we didn't know what was going on, and then they finally figured that out.
Cut. You're gonna have to do that in coverage, Pete. Yeah.
You can't threaten them, you can't sort of plead with them. You can't start crying and hope that they feel some sympathy towards you. Can't do anything that they normally do with actors.
With the actors, when it comes to horses, you've got guys like Vigo, who is a very capable horse person.
Vigo put in so much effort to work with the horses, and he would come out earlier than what he was required. He'd come out, he'd go out and catch his own horse, bring it in and groom it, saddle it up, and we'd go for a ride.
I've made a lot of friends in New Zealand, but I would say he's, without question, my best friend in New Zealand is this guy.
Urias was a horse that Vigo spent a lot of time with because he wanted the bond between him and Brago to be something that you were able to sense on screen, and so the only way to really do that was for him to bond with the horse in real life. And I know that Vigo occasionally would go to the stables and actually sleep with the horse. I mean, you know, Vigo's pretty amazing like that. He could have been in a hotel, but he wanted this to be a very real relationship.
Well, I was near the horses, but I didn't sleep with the horse, despite, you know, rumors to the contrary. Which I have a feeling that Dominic had his hand in spreading some of those.
He put a lot of time in when we trained Brago to lay down and push for the two towers when Brago rescues Aragorn from the riverbank.
I'll get over, you can roll me a little ways if he wants.
Okay.
Even if he's trained to do that, he'll do one if we want, right?
Oh yeah, for sure, yep. Yep. Okay. Head down, push. Head down, push, pushing, 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 push, 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 push. Atta boy,
That's good. A good boy.
Good.
Good boy.
He's very confident around them, very relaxed around them, so they respond really well to him. When he's on a horse, he just looks like he should be there, which is, yeah, I think it's really special. You know, not many people have that.
Keep going, keep going.
Those who had to do a lot of riding on camera, Carl Urban as Éomer, and Bernard Hill as Theoden, Orlando Bloom as Legolas. We were able to do our own work because we worked hard at it.
I came out 5 months before we started filming, and I was training like mad to do the horse riding and stuff, and I don't know, it's all come together here, which is amazing because we're in the horseman's country, you know. Getting really connected to the horse as well. I'm riding a guy called Percy. But it's nice that we've got a real connection now, and I feel like I can really ride him well because the elves are renowned for being, you know, excellent horsemen. He's one of the best horses on set. He's certainly the boy. He's a great ride. Couldn't do it without these animals.
I think all the actors coped very well with the horses.
It was good. I mean, I haven't really got any notes. I think it's you just working your way into it and then just do a couple more takes. It's getting good. Yep.
It was kind of challenging, you know, because I hadn't done much horse riding before, but I sort of really have grown to love them. They're beautiful animals. I really do love them, and you have to bond with each different animal because sometimes you'll get a different horse, and it's like being back at square one again. You know, they can be quite temperamental if they're having a bad day and they're getting their hooves and they're stamping them in the water, and you know. So, but no, I'm really enjoying working with them. They're fantastic.
You know, we all got a lot of help. I mean, the horse department was very loyal, affectionate, and extremely helpful to the actors.
Too long?
No, they're about right.
Are they?
We're disturbingly familiar. Have the same kind of same measurements and everything.
Bernard came up for a lot of lessons, mainly because he enjoyed it, not especially because he needed extra lessons, but he threw his heart into it.
We put him on a horse called Hercules, which was a big grey Percheron cross horse. But the horse had a really good temperament.
You can't just take a horse out of a stable first thing in the morning, throw a saddle on it, and then get on and expect it to go galloping down the field. It just won't do it. So our social hours with the horses were as much to do with our appreciation of them rather than anything else, you know. Used to just love being with the horses.
Spreading in fours, left, right. Where you going, Graham? Go wide.
Bernard and Miranda are really good, considering the amount of riding that they do and the amount of time that they get to spend riding. It's good that they are motivated to come and ride with us, spend time, and they have a genuine interest in the horses, and they like doing it.
Come on. Go, 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 go. You're going to run out.
My horse was Dublin. He was very beautiful, slightly lazy, especially with a rider who's not really a rider, you know. He knew that he could get away with not working sometimes.
As soon as the actor sits on them, they know what the actor's like as a rider. You know, when the actor says, giddy up, or whatever they say to get the horse going, the horse knows whether he means it or not, you know.
I could sit on this horse and give him, like, you know, gentle kicks and be like, "Hah! Hah!" And this horse would just be...
If you've got actors that don't actually control the horses all that well, they'll just take off when they hear action. So you get to where you can't say action. You can't even say camera rolling because the horses know that means something's going to happen, you know.
So they get to the point where Dave Norris would say, and Christmas trees, or, you know, they'd come up with all these funny little words that would be my cue, just to trick the horse so he wouldn't get too hyperactive and, you know, shoot off before the gun kind of thing.
I'm not going to give an action call when we shoot this because Basil's on this lovely horse, blank go, and we don't want to spook him.
I know Bernard felt that the word action was just a curse, you know, for his horse. Every time they'd say it, he'd go berserk, you know.
He's very self-willed. He now knows that when it's winding up for action and stand by, and he's up and jumping around.
There was one day, I don't know if David Wenham remembers this, but we had him on a horse for this big charge going towards Gilead.
David wasn't a great rider. He's a great guy. And his horse took off on him.
Jeff was filming and I was on my horse and he called action and I was pretty much out of the frame by the time the N on action had completed being called.
And his horse just bolted.
He just disappeared. He finished up 100 yards ahead of the rest.
And there was David sitting there going, what do I do? You know, I can't stop it. I can't slow the horse down.
Actually, the funniest thing, though, is that you'd want a shot, say, of David Wenham in foreground, big close-up, with the whole host galloping behind him. Well, you can't get that with him on a horse. So what we had was a 44-gallon drum bolted to the side of the car with a saddle on it and a bit of mane and stuff like that. And the actor would sit on this 44-gallon drum, pretending to ride a horse.
The best direction that they can give people is, and I suppose we'll be cutting here, is make out as though you're actually having sex on the barrel.
No, I'd say to David Wenham, "Fuck this horse, will you?" You know?
The rushes of my particular bit on the barrel actually did look as though I was doing something to the barrel as opposed to riding the horse.
Riding the barrel can tend to look like other activities. You have to be careful how you ride the barrel or people will watch and laugh, basically. It does look silly.
And they had one on wheels too that they could push across the set. It was like such a hoot watching it, this stuff being filmed.
You know, it makes you feel kind of foolish. You know, you're not delving into Shakespeare at this point.
Let's be serious.
Is this serious? Let's make a movie here.
3, 2, 1, action.
Just go back there. I think he's broke a leg.
By the time we got to pickups for film 3, Richard Taylor and Steve Ingram collaborated on building a really sophisticated computer controlled horse rig.
So it's just been christened by Jamie here, the phony pony. So that's its name on set to differentiate it from the barrel rig horse. Fantastic.
Its eyes can move, its mouth can move, its ears can move. The whole of its body can move. It would gallop.
That was the Mercedes of fake riding.
Okay, put it on full.
Okay, the bucking Bronto. Woo!
Here, Pete, it's another $1. We'll get another 2 minutes.
Today we're shooting a scene for the third movie. It's the charge of the Rohirrim in Pillinor Fields outside of Minas Tirith. It's one of the big spectacular scenes from the whole trilogy, really, and it's a day that I think a lot of us have been looking forward to for a long time. It was probably 3 or 4 years ago that Richard Taylor and I were talking about how many Rohan costumes he should build, and I said, well, let's make 250 because I'd love to get 250 riders on horses.
We had about 50 company horses, of which I think we used about 30 in the Pillinor Fields, so we needed something like 220 extras on horseback. New Zealand is a country of about 4 million people and 40 million sheep. And that means if you're filming in a rural area, you have to count on the fact that during the sheep shearing season, you had to cast a wider net.
You'd be shooting in lambing season and nobody would turn up because because the farmers, you know, as much as they might want to be in the movie for the day, have to go and deal with the lambs. You know, the real world kept tripping us up.
So we turned to a guy named Steve Auld and found all of our horses across New Zealand.
I'd just do a press release and call in people with horses of a certain height, and we'd just get them in and have a look.
And I remember when they put out a call for all able-bodied horse riders to, you know, partake in the charge of Pillinor Fields. It was like this Woodstockian trek, you know, horse riders from all over the country were coming down, you know, congregating on this one field outside of Twizel, whether they could ride or not, you know. Everyone just really wanted to be a part of it.
So the variety of riders and horses was just amazing. But I think that would be how it would be in Middle Earth too, you know, it'd be every man and his horse coming to battle.
It wasn't easy. You know, looking back, I had a couple of Canadian guys who have been in the game for a long time, John Scott, Lyle Edge. They joined me at Twizel.
It's probably one of the bigger days in the picture as far as the horses and the wardrobe and the people are concerned. We've got pretty close to 250 riders here, and getting them all to work together. Columns of 2, columns of 4s, lineups of 50, and proceed like warriors.
Steve, send me one with armor. I need one Royal Guard here, please.
A lot of these people, and it's all credit to them that they hung in there, had never been on a film set before. They had no idea what they were in for. It became cold, it became very, very long days.
Some people would come, and after about 2 or 3 days, they'd go, this is too much like hard work, and they'd clear out.
They would just say, I don't want to do this anymore. This isn't what I signed up for.
So I think after the first week, we were down to about 150 extras, and they were the ones who really dug it in, and that good old Kiwi spirit came out, and they were there for the duration, and they were going to make it work. They were going to make it happen.
People stay in their trucks and floats because there isn't accommodation, and also it's good to have people close to their horses in case anything happens.
You've got a perfectly good float there, so you might as well sleep in that. So, I mean, that's not a bit of flat ground and everybody's happy.
My name is Zoe Miller. I'm from Dunedin. This is Herman. And together we travel in this truck here. And it's sort of become home. I've got things thrown here, there and everywhere, all over the place. But basically we just camp out in vehicles like these and have a few drinks in the evening. Meals are all provided, which are fantastic. And basically it's just a bit of a social time.
You threw the food before I put it in his mouth.
Doesn't like it.
Oh, no. Like that, you see?
The commitment level of a race.
Oh, mate, he's got the right idea.
Yeah, definitely having fun. Yeah, always having fun.
So apart from the hardship, there was a lot of fun and camaraderie as well.
Ironically, the thing that almost brought it to a halt was the humble rabbit.
One of the most dangerous things for horses are actually rabbit holes.
If a horse steps in a rabbit hole, it can break its leg and throw the rider and all that. So there'd be people going across the land where we were going to have them galloping, prodding the ground to make sure there wasn't a rabbit hole just below the surface because the horse would break through.
We also would, of course, before every charge, the individual riders would go out on their horses, all 300 of them, and walk their horses through the field and then walk back to the beginning start mark. And if they found any faulty ground, they were able to get it filled in.
It was like much more complicated. You just watch all these horses gallop and you go, yeah, that looks great, but the work to do to get it like that was incredible.
We did some huge gallop throughs with lots of stunt players on the ground.
I think there was like 250 horses just barreling through, and we had big safety lanes for guys. I mean, they weren't that big, but the horses were good enough that they ran down it.
The horses rode into them like that, you know, and the guys at the front would hurl themselves backwards, and the illusion's very strong that they'd been hit, you know.
It was actually, there was a few close calls, but everyone came through unscathed. It's to be expected with horses. Never a dull moment when they're charging at you.
When you're doing a bit of a charge scene or something, you just hang on like Grimm's death, because if you're in the front, you don't want to fall off, because you think about the other 250 riders are going to run over top of you.
One charge we did across the plains, one of the leading guys fell off his horse.
His saddle slipped right down underneath the horse, and he actually came off with horses, 200 horses coming behind him, and they managed to step around him.
All the horses behind just swerved, one or two jumped over top of him.
I was convinced he would have to die, you know. And then they all galloped past, and at the end he stands up and he was completely unscathed.
Fortunately, we had no real horse collisions, nobody got hurt.
We'll go to enormous efforts to make a film good, but you don't want to hurt people. You know what I mean?
We got to have the three guys in front, and Bernard's got to ride in front of them again. Are we sure that there's enough room up there for Bernard to do that? I mean, it looks good where they are. Bernard had come up with this idea of a sort of a ritualistic warrior kind of thing that the king would do with his frontline troops, which was riding along the front row, holding out his sword as they put their spears down and sort of rattling the sword along the shafts of the spears and creating this sound.
I don't know, I thought, would it be great for the final kind of rousing battle thing for Pelennor Fields, you know? You can kind of just, if I could ride down the line of spears and all that kind of stuff. So I then began to sell it to Pete, and he bought it. So I had to learn how to ride to make it look good.
Ride now! Ride for ruin! On the world's ending!
250 riders, you know, a lot of whom I knew. So I wasn't going to make a fool of myself. So that kind of spurred me on, really.
He actually generated enough enthusiasm and enough power that we really thought we were doing it. And when he said charge and we're calling death, 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 it was deafening.
It was not hard to get caught up in the moment, you know, to have that many horse riders all built up in their armor, and Theoden, you know, egging them on to basically fight to the last man.
It was like this overwhelming kind of surge of energy, and then hammer went down and we were allowed to gallop these horses as fast as we possibly could, swinging our weapons. It doesn't get any better than that.
200-odd horses just charging down this plain. It was spectacular.
Literally, they would be halfway down and the ground was shaking.
Those moments were phenomenal. I mean, the ride at the Rohirrim, in terms of film job experience, it's number one, without a doubt. And it'll take a long time to knock it off the top.
It's really hard when you go on a film and you purchase a horse and then train it and turn it from an average horse into something that's, you know, a highly trained film horse that's done a great job, and then at the end of the film have to walk away from it, you know, because you'll walk away with that sense that you may never see that horse again.
When it came to the end of Pickup Shots 2003, and for the first time all these horses that the company had, I think there was about 8 of them, carried all the way through from right start to finish. They were all going to be sold. And the company offered them to all the riders first.
I actually bought one of the horses from the shoot because I fell in love with him. He kept me safe, I kept him safe. This is my horse Seb. He was on the film for 3 years, from the time he was 3 to the time he was 6. He's one of the Rohan horses, and Gondorian and whatever else. Can you come up and say hi to the camera? That kind of bond is something that people who've never been in that situation probably don't understand. He's telling me he wants me to scratch his head, or that he wants to go.
I always swore right through this movie that I would never buy one of the horses, and that I would in fact not buy a horse at all. Come and say hello to all those people out there watching this movie, Branko. Yeah, they're all watching you on this DVD. I had a lapse in determination or concentration, I'm not sure which it was. But, and I ended up buying Blanco, and he sits up there at home, and he's retired. He gets ridden up the hills at the back, and he's enjoying life.
At the end of filming, Vigo, he very much fell in love with Uraeus, and so he ended up buying him. And he loves a scratch just here. And I'm just looking after him for Vigo until he goes back to America at some stage.
Jane's an ideal person to watch over him, and who knows him and who is trusted by him, you know.
Vigo's one of those people who is really down to earth, and I know that he was amazed at Jane's riding on Florian and Jane Abbott's riding. At the end of the shoot, I remember Jane saying one day, "Oh, I wish I could buy that horse, but he's an expensive horse, being a stallion." I said, "Look, I love this horse. I would so like to buy him at the end of filming. I didn't have any idea how on earth I was going to afford him, but I knew that my bid wouldn't get as far as Wellington." You know, the simple factor of the matter was there was someone else who wanted that horse, someone higher up in the department, and she didn't think she was going to be able to. And, I mean, Vigo heard about this, and so he said, "Well, I'll bid on him for you." And then I've still got the message saved on my phone where he says, "Hey, Jane, good news, I've got Florian, you know, you can go and pick him up at the end, you know. He's at the farm, you can go and pick him up." And it was just like, oh my God. And I rang him and I said, thank you, that's brilliant. You know, how much do I owe you? You know, thanks so much for doing that. And he says, no, I want to give him to you. No one else is more deserving than Jane to have that horse. She did all the riding on it, she made the horse look good, so I'm glad that it happened that way. You know, that's just Vigo. You know, he just did it because he understood. So I'm incredibly lucky.
It was a lovely touch on Vigo's part to give Jane that horse. And he's a lovely horse. Jane's got him pretty much tuned up as well. He does all sorts of lovely little tricks and various things.
You're so funny.
I think Lord of the Rings, it just took up everybody, because they came from everywhere. Just fantastic.
I take my hat off to every single one of the people that fronted up on horseback and was a part of that thing, because it was the hardest job that they'll probably ever do. And I think that people should never forget that one of the reasons why these films work so well is because the guy 100 horses out was doing his job. And I take my hat off to every one of you. I don't know where you are now, I don't know where you are, but thank you very much for making it a superb film.
There's never been a costume that's been to do with Lord of the Rings that hasn't been challenging. Each costume that you're making requires so much love to get it to the point where you are willing to put it in front of the camera. For example, when we developed the Smeagol outfit, both Andy and I kept working on ideas, which was fabulous because you actually get to understand who he is, and it gave Andy the chance to think it through.
Given that his family were a fishing culture, we worked out that he'd have little bits of shells and fish hooks and things that meant something to him, and bits of things he'd found and dug up. But again, trying to retain the status of the character, I was trying to find ways of making him slightly more wealthy looking.
There is something about him that is slightly vain, that little neckerchief that he wears.
It was kind of slightly spotted, and he slightly dandified him in some way.
So again, it comes back to starting to let the audience know beforehand that there is something about Smeagol that isn't as endearing as a hobbit.
We've had the same costume now for, 4 years or whatever, and luckily Tolkien wrote that Pippin becomes a Knight of Gondor, which means I get a right nice costume.
And Merry becomes a captain of Rohan. Both of these costumes are very intricate. In Pippin's case, beautiful black velvet with the embroidered Tree of Gondor and silver on it, and the same with Merry's costume. It's very, very intricately embroidered with the double horse heads of Rohan. Sam and Frodo were given elven robes. Then we actually put a lot of effort into those. Once again, sort of trying out new techniques of acid etching into over-dyed velvets.
So we're looking smart. I think I've got the coolest one.
Action! What did you do? Go back to the shithole!
This is Gandalf the White, of course. This was a tough one because how do you follow on from Gandalf the Grey, and how do you create this version of Gandalf? Well, what we wanted was a much more virile Gandalf, and it was certainly how Ian McKellen viewed the character in this guise. I mean, he wanted to be able to fight, he wanted to be able to move. What we didn't want was the volume in the costume that we had had in Gandalf the Grey. The other thing that I wanted to do was to impart a little more elven quality, so that we had a sense of him being one foot in another world. We used some very beautiful fabrics in this. Again, they're quite subtle, and the immediate version to the eye of this is just a cream costume, but it has a lot more happening than that. These designs here on the sleeve, elven designs, which is repeated through Elrond and other characters, so it's just been reworked into this costume. And then the undergarment is very much an elven fabric, which tied him into the elven world.
This immaculately embroidered gown can never be seen. There's no point in doing it, other than making me believe as I put them on that they're real clothes, which I do. We started with a t-shirt. Then we had a shirt, then we got a robe. It's 3 layers. But they never came up with any decent underwear for Gandalf. They did try.
We had this palette for Gondor, the sort of silvers and the blacks. Well, I stepped away from that with Faramir because I didn't want to relate too closely to Boromir. I wanted to keep him the younger brother.
Nyla had an idea that in terms of what Faramir did, the fact that he was a ranger through the forest of Ithilien or whatever, she had an idea that the costume should nearly be sort of similar in a way to Aragorn.
The ranger costumes were designed for the idea that they were very practical, that they were frequently on foot, and that they needed to be slightly camouflaged. So we definitely worked with a brown-green palette for these costumes. We used quite a lot of leather and oilskin, the idea being that both were warm and waterproof. We created this front piece, and we did this by creating a large die to actually stencil it in so that it had a relief quality to it to make it a little bit more interesting. Everything about Faramir is so much more genuine, but this sort of this terrible desire to please this hideous father. I came up with the look for Denethor in exactly the same way that I came up with everyone else. I just started drawing a portrait of him. How do you make this man menacing? How do you make him this man who is, heading to the edge of sanity? We wanted to make him vain and expensive, to make him look like he is wearing the most luscious of fur pelts and velvets and embroidery, and just making it as grandiose as I possibly could without resorting to colour. And then, of course, adding in the chainmail.
That's the largest suit of chain that an actor would be able to wear for, say, 10 hours at a time.
Putting it on was a weight, but after a while you'd forget about it. But then when I took it off in the evening, it would be floating. That was how heavy it was.
The vanity of the man, that he imagined himself as a soldier of any kind. that was what fascinated me the most about that character. There needed to be sort of quite a clear idea that the Rohan people were a lesser civilization, I suppose, compared to Gondor. Eowyn is the niece of a king, so we wanted to make her clothes reflect that she's royalty, but also have a simplicity to them at the same time. This is the costume that you first meet Eowyn in. The garment itself is this green velvet, and then the underskirt is this leaf pattern, which has got quite a lot of metal thread in it. So it just gives a little bit of a kick in the light. And we took that piece of fabric as part of the underskirt and quilted it into this neck piece. These are Indian fabrics, and they've been put through quite heavy dye processes which change the quality of the metal and make them look very antiqued.
It's such a beautiful colour, that green, and it's such heavy, heavy velvet, and when you moved, it just kind of swayed from side to side. It just had such great weight about it. She's, you know, the White Lady of Rohan, so the white dress was very important. It had to symbolise so many things, you know. It had to have that sort of medieval Lady of Rohan look, or princess look, if you like. But it also had to have a strength to it.
It's very simple, but has this elaborate gold and silver detail around the neck and really sort of beautiful interior sleeve linings and actually laces around the arms, exactly like this, but ultimately it crosses over in a very Saxon style when it's on her. And she looked fabulous in this dress.
Nyla would be whipping things up in about 3 days, and they actually turn into gorgeous frocks. I don't know how she does it.
We had already filmed a scene of Eowyn in the eggshell blue coat with the big fur collar, and then Peter wanted to shoot a scene earlier, so we needed to show the dress that was underneath this cloak.
She's ended up designing something that sort of sits over that, so it suddenly becomes this beautiful, regal banquet dress.
It was a chance to try a very different medieval design style that has a sort of separate embroidered front piece. And that turned out to be a really beautiful and very delicate dress. And I remember the premiere, and I remember thinking as that scene came up, oh my God, this is classic Peter. It's just a headshot. No point in having any ego when it comes to these things.
I wish there'd been more girls for her in it, because I think she liked having a chance to dress the girls, you know.
Yes, it was very much the relief for the wardrobe department to make some very beautiful dresses. This is what was known in the wardrobe as Arwen's dying frock. The first time Liv put this dress on, it was a magic moment and has continued to be so. The costume really began with these two colours, and once again constantly over-dyeing these to get this aged red colour. And then we worked in this brocade. The girls in the wardrobe department have actually hand-stitched all of this embroidery. Hours and hours of work. And these huge sleeves, they just drop right back, and so her arm will suddenly appear quite naked on screen, and it's incredibly sensual. Well, that's what the costume designer thinks. I had done this portrait of Liv wearing the coronation crown, which was based on the idea of a butterfly, and it had to have the hanging jewels. And my reason for that was that I wanted to frame her ears. So it was all about highlighting those fabulous little elfin ears.
In this film, I have this like incredible, almost like lime green dress.
Fran said that her and Peter would really like Arwen to be in green at the coronation. And so the mission of my dye house was to keep dyeing me up pieces of fabric in every possible shade of green until I fell in love with one of them. And finally, we found that green. It did all the things it needed to. It had enough blue in it to bring out the blue in Liv's eyes. It had enough yellow in it to ensure that it was still going to be green. It was soft enough to allow me to believe in it as a coronation gown.
Of course, it was more beautiful than I ever dreamed it could be.
Even on the set of Lord of the Rings in New Zealand, we can be stylish.
There's an enormous passion here, and it drives everything. The amount of people that have worked on every dress, from cutter to dyer to embroiderers to, you know, nights at 4 o'clock in the morning when there would be 5 people stitching each corner of a dress in order to get it finished in time.
Well, it works.
I mean, I just can't imagine just how much everyone has given to it. And if you didn't buy into that, then, good and bad, then go and do something that's much better for your blood pressure.
Peter was really committed to the idea of doing a lot of miniature work in art films, which is not necessarily typical today because you can do so much with pure CG.
Pete loves miniatures. He's often said that if he couldn't be a director, he would want to be a miniature cameraman. I think he just likes being around them. Of course, you can see that, his background. Way back the time when he was a young man, he was building miniatures and he was shooting them and blowing them up. You never get that out of your blood. It's the world's biggest electric train.
Pete's the biggest kid of all. The film is kind of incidental, really. It's playing with the toys, which is the main thing. And, you know, they're beautiful objects. The guys at the workshop and the miniatures unit put a fantastic amount of care and love into everything that they did.
I think it's really evident in the films. If you look at them, you can see how rich those miniatures are and how realistic they are. They add something that you wouldn't get any other way.
Minas Morgul's original name was Minas Ithil, and it was a Gondorian city and the sister city of Minas Tirith before falling into Sauron's hands.
So we wanted it to evoke Minas Tirith, but have a different design sense.
And this prow of rock that divides Minas Tirith was a design element that I decided to carry over into Minas Morgul, in that these promontories of rock be reproduced in the battlements.
So John Howe created this city, which in itself would have had a beauty to it. But what has happened since the Orcs took over that part of the land is that they have put iron balustrades around, which have stained the side of these beautiful white walls, all these rust stains.
And I have very vivid memories of having my wisdom teeth pulled, and this dentist clamping my wisdom teeth in these sort of jaws. And I wanted to try and convey some of that horrid notion of metal clamping onto and digging into enamel, or in this case, the white stone of Minas Morgul.
This is a 120th scale of Minas Morgul. The whole set is built specifically to have the camera gradually go higher and higher and higher up the valley, looking down past the hobbits as they climb. And then we've also got one that's 3 times bigger than this for the close-ups.
And it has a green glow, which is part of the book, describing a supernatural kind of swamp.
Paler indeed than the moon, ailing in some slow eclipse was the light of it now, wavering and blowing like a noisome exhalation of decay, a corpse light, a light that illuminated nothing.
So we painted with this glow paint, and then we light it with ultraviolet to produce this sickly look. But then when we turn the UV lights off, then we can just light it in a normal way. So you actually have the normal moonlight in addition without seeing this stuff. So there's actually 4 different lighting schemes at work, all of which are used to produce the final effect. Cirith was built by the ancient Númenóreans as a fortress guarding the borders of Mordor. It's the one that the Orcs have really taken over and made it their own.
I'd initially done a sketch which was pretty close to the description in the book. That initial design ended up being judged pretty boring. I revisited the whole thing and basically pulled the fortress away from the slope of the mountain and placed it out on this rocky pinnacle. And each successive courtyard is at an angle to the one below it. So it is faithful to the description in the book, but gives it more of a crazy, vertiginous aspect.
The first time you see it is from Shelob's lair, actually. You see just the top of the tower. And they actually took it off the miniature and took it down to the shooting stage and plonked it at the end of that set.
This is a very rare moment that we actually have a tangible
tower in the background. So this is kind of a special moment, because normally we have like a blue screen to look at, and now we don't have to use our imagination, because there it is.
When it came back, I was able to put some more detail, because I had heard there was going to be some close-ups on it.
Part of the richness of any miniature is the amount of fine texture you can get into it. And just looking at a huge stone building isn't very interesting. As soon as you can hang a few chains on it and knock some holes in it and texture it up, of course, then it starts to be more interesting and it starts to be more believable. It was my favorite of the orcish sets because of that tremendous sense of detail. Everything about it was sort of macabre, gothic quality. So it was a joy to light. You couldn't light it wrong. You just put back cross light on it, and it looks fantastic.
I really remember wondering what the paths of the dead could be, and Peter simply didn't want a dark, damp hole. Peter wanted another world inside.
And I did some drawings of this necropolis, which would actually have the tomb of the King of the Dead as a central focus.
The actual structures themselves have the same kind of feel of this place called Petra in Jordan. And, you know, I know that when they were doing the early design, you know, people actually talked about that as a reference point.
And Peter decides that the necropolis should crack open and release the skulls of these thousands and thousands of people who've been interred there over the years.
So initially it was like, can you make 200 skulls? No problem. And then it came back, 2,000, no problem. It might take a week. And then 2,000 became 6,000, 6,000 became 10,000, 10,000 became 20,000, and ultimately 60,000.
And then, in the end, we needed to get 20,000 more, 80,000 skulls. And you say, it's an awful lot of skulls. No, it's not. It's just barely 1 cubic meter of skulls. So 1 cubic meter of skulls having to be built into this huge set. You have to load these things and then just hope that nothing gives away until you actually have the camera rolling.
The slightest bit of vibration would crumble the whole thing, and then we'd have to go in and start again.
So this took more engineering than any other physical effect that we did. But we managed to make it work finally.
Absolutely great, guys.
And they'd also done a lot of live action shooting of full-size skulls.
It's pretty cool.
Once we rolled the skulls down, we had to pick them all up and take them back to the top and do it again.
It was sort of fun. You know, people had bags and they were sort of like shooting baskets. And after a while, throwing skulls at each other, it was kind of a weird atmosphere.
We had to extend those shots. We would work out what the angle had to be to match the live action full-size piece and then start the cascade of skulls up so that we could make it look like the avalanche just sort of stretched away into the distance. Minas Tirith is Tolkien's greatest architectural invention. It's absolutely gigantic. In the real world, it would have been almost a third of a mile high, 1,700 feet. Now think of this. When we were shooting the Two Towers, our major set piece was Helm's Deep, a gigantic fortress, and Minas Tirith dwarfs Helm's Deep.
Minas Tirith was one of the first miniatures that we did for the third film, and that was based on Alan Lee's drawings.
I sort of approached it on two fronts, really, and one was going through the front door and taking a very close-up view of the city as it unfolds. And at the same time, I started thinking about the wider view. The way that the model was developed was not dissimilar to the way that a city would have grown and changed and gradually been built up over the years. And actually having a whole group of model makers on it was really helpful in that respect. They'd each be an architect from a different period that would be doing their own little speculative development.
We installed over 1,000 individual houses to make up the habitations of the streets of Minas Tirith.
Minas Tirith in its entirety was built at 1/72nd scale.
So Minas Tirith was as big as our room. We couldn't make it physically any bigger. The buildings at the top were just scraping the beams on the underside of our miniatures building room.
The complete set of Minas Tirith was 7 meters tall and 6.5 meters in diameter. It's an enormous structure.
We also built large sections of the walls and roads of Minas Tirith at 14th scale. That's a scale that's really big enough for you to walk through the city streets. You can duck down and look through the little doors and windows.
We use this one to shoot close detail shots that wouldn't stand up on the other set. This is beautifully detailed to the point where you can go closer and closer and closer, and you keep seeing more and more.
When I saw Minas Tirith for the first time in the cinema, I just was so impressed. I have never been so impressed in my life. I just don't think I blinked for the whole sequence.
I kept wishing as I was watching the film, wouldn't it be wonderful to just stroll in the streets of Minas Tirith?
The scale of that vision is just incredible, and where have we seen anything like that before? The trebuchets in Minas Tirith were proper medieval lever artillery as opposed to catapults.
The catapults are basically like slingshots, and a trebuchet would be more the equivalent of a sling with a pretty substantial weight on the end of an arm with a fulcrum in the middle. So you're actually using the momentum of a sling on the end of a very long wooden beam.
In theory, there's no limit to how big you could make them or the size of thing you could throw.
The medieval illustrations that remain are very difficult to interpret because the same element may actually be drawn from the side at the top, from the front in the middle, and from the other side at the bottom.
And John built a little tabletop one.
One of the ones we actually built for the 72nd scale model, I was just kind of intrigued to see if it would work.
He was working on his table one day, and this pencil eraser went winging past my head. I went, whee, what was that?
And I used to shoot rubbers over to Mary at her desk on the other side of the room.
All I know is I managed to get my hands on a little trebuchet and fling some erasers back. The next one he built was probably about 14th scale. That was a real beauty. And he got that so beautifully weighted that he could throw a pencil eraser the length of the car park.
Firing lumps of clay across the car park into the bushes at the end of our workshop, and we had a great time with that.
A bunch of big kids playing with these amazing toys which they're privileged enough to be able to spend their working lives around.
Grand is a huge battering ram with its head in the shape of a wolf. It's a very, very daring graphic element for Tolkien to have actually described.
Great engines crawled across the field, and in the midst was a huge ram, great as a forest tree 100 feet in length, swinging on mighty chains. Long had it been forging in the dark smithies of Mordor, and its hideous head, founded of black steel, was shaped in the likeness of a ravening wolf.
The wolf-headed battering ram that Tolkien described, we wanted to take one step further and in fact made the whole of the battering ram to look like a massive cast iron wolf.
The model of the battering ram itself of Grand was quite huge. It was the size of like a van.
And it was all clad in lead. It was very, very heavy.
Working with lead is it's a toxic metal. We're not going to take chances, so we wear gloves and touch it as little as possible. It's certainly a beautiful metal to work with, so malleable and shapeable.
We decided to cover the whole thing in inscriptions as well. And I know that one has lots of spelling mistakes. Mordor spelling mistakes.
And the Tolkien experts will be able to read it, but for everybody else, it says, no wall between, no power against, no endurance of souls, Grond, the wheel of Mordor. And this is repeated all over the shoulders and a little bit over the eyes as well.
Weta had built this miniature of Grand and it had sat in storage for forever. Some people thought we were never going to shoot it, it was never going to appear in the movies, but at the last minute we wheeled it onto the stage.
The brief was, Grand hits the door, then Grand hits it again, and, his nose comes through. And then Grand hits it a third time, and that's when it all breaks open and the doors fly open. Well, of course, that was the theory, but when we went and shot it, the first time Grand went through, it just went smash through and it all came out. The model builder who actually built Grand was there taking care of his model, and it was my job to just smash it into doors over and over and over again. And this poor guy, you just see the look on his face.
He gave the door a good whack yesterday, which broke a couple of his toes, but just bend the lead back into shape and a bit of glue and he's back together again.
I broke his claw, I broke his nose, you know, I just did everything, and you know, it didn't matter, it just had to be exciting. You had to feel the impact as it smashed into the door.
The Grey Havens boat did exist already in the conceptual art, but we asked Alan for something a bit more concrete.
I did 1 or 2 drawings showing the whole thing, and then I did some kind of plan and elevation drawings as well for John to get started.
John is a boat enthusiast and has indeed even acted as a guide on a replica of Captain Cook's ship.
He loves boats. He knows them intimately. He builds his own. He's got his own little sailboat that he takes his family out on.
The hull itself went together very quickly. I'm pretty sure we would have had most of it up in 3 or 4 days. We used plywood frames and diagonal plywood planking. And the figurehead, Richard carved that. It was great to get Richard out of the office and down into the workshop where he loves to be.
Let's go and have some beers at the boat.
It's actually fully watertight, that boat, so it'd be nice to think that it would be able to sail away on the ocean one day.
We don't quite see enough of the Elven boat, but it was beautifully executed and very satisfying.
Grey Havens originally was planned as a foreground element with a matte painting in the background. So we had a foreground 14th scale miniature.
A year later, we got word that they wanted really some more of the city.
So we went back to the drawings, and one of the influences for the Grey Havens was actually paintings that I'd seen by Turner, showing these exotic harbours with a view out to sea with the setting sun.
Working in that set was one of the most rewarding of all the sequences that we did. And I think one of the reasons for that is that it represented all that we'd learned.
We'd done so many big models prior to that we were sort of quite a good team now. We could pretty much, yeah, there's your model, right, next.
And it was interesting to see how much their style had matured and their technique had matured. It was a beauty.
Of all the units that we had shooting stuff on these movies, the longest serving, most loyal, hard-working unit was the miniatures unit. I didn't set out to torture the miniatures department on purpose, but there was a weird thing of they never seemed to quite stop, and they never knew when they were done with Lord of the Rings.
I believe this may be the longest that a crew has ever shot certainly on an effects unit.
They went a little bit strange in the head over that period of time.
Every so often we would, day 200, day 500, day 666, we'd have a little party.
I decided that we should have a party because it's shoot day 666 and it's a pretty historic, momentous occasion.
You'll have to excuse the neck. This is our party this evening for the 666th shoot day.
Next thing you know, there's devil music and there's devil invitations and everybody's wearing red suits and all this stuff.
Lord High Executioner, mighty wall.
And then everybody's got to get up on the runway and do a little skit or whatever. So it's a lot of fun.
Mr. Man himself, Alex Funky.
I'm more looking forward to like shoot day 800, maybe even 900, and then, you know, if you come and interview us, then we're probably a little bit more whacked out than we already are.
Those poor guys ended up shooting for over 1,000 days. People shoot feature films in 30 days, and they were shooting those models for 1,000 days.
And I must admit, it has been a long haul. It's enough time to actually get to know people so well, you know them too well.
Even when we thought they'd shot their last shot and there was some sort of celebration, I then wanted the model of Orthanc to be dragged out so I could do a wide shot circling around for the extended edition.
Everybody's sort of getting ready to go on holiday, and then people start drinking, and then we get this phone call from Dean, right? And he's with Pete. He goes, I'm with Peter, and we need another shot.
Oh, they must be right in the middle of their rap party.
I can hear Peter laughing in the background, and I tell the crew, and they're like, oh, it's Peter's idea of a joke. They don't want it. They don't want it.
I'm not joking.
Dear, oh dear.
What?
The laughter doesn't really help, does it?
And so that's all right. The team knows how to do this stuff. They push on in, they start the motion control back up, light the set, and shoot it.
They're a unit with a wonderful spirit and obviously, you know, incredible skill because the miniatures are fantastic.
When we started out, everybody that we brought together was talented and able, but none of them had anything to do with actually shooting miniatures.
And I would imagine that by now, these guys are as good a miniature crew as anyone in the world, if not the best miniature crew in the world.
They've allowed us to create a Middle-earth which is very definitely real. And I think it makes a huge amount of difference to the engagement that you have with the films.
So much of what the miniature department and Richard Taylor's team and Alan and John have done has actually enhanced what my imagination of the book was. And that's because it's gone so much beyond what I was imagining and had the input of all these other people who have contributed to it. And it's been one of the exciting aspects of working on these films.